Tonight we're heading deep into the heart of Texas, a land that stretches wide under a burning sun and hides its darkest secrets in the quiet spaces between small towns. Every mile of cracked asphalt and every patch of dry earth here has a story. Some about families that vanished overnight, others about voices that still call out from wells and riverbeds long gone dry. These are the stories whispered at gas stations, passed between locals in hushed tones, 20 true haunting Texas small-town stories locals refuse to discuss. From the shadowed woods of Palo Pinto to the ghost-lit roads of Terlingua, from barns that burn without fire to rivers that sing when no wind blows, every corner of Texas holds a memory the land won't let die. These tales aren't legend. They're scars left behind by people who saw something they shouldn't have and lived long enough to warn others not to go back. But before we begin, there's something strange. Almost 90% of people who watch these stories never subscribe. They hear the warnings, they feel the chill, and then they disappear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to hear, what Texas keeps buried under its dust, is only for those brave enough to stay until the end. Now tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Because here in Texas, when the sun dips behind the hills and the wind goes still, that's when the truth crawls out. So dim the lights, sit back, and get ready for 20 true haunting Texas small-town stories locals refuse to discuss. The stretch of I-10 that cuts through Van Horn feels like a wound in the desert. Asphalt shimmered beneath the moonlight, and beyond the highway there was nothing but dry brush, rock, and an occasional lonely radio tower blinking red in the distance. Around midnight, the town itself looked half dead. Just a few motels, a pair of gas stations, and a diner that closed at 10. When Kyle's gas light came on, he was the only car on the road for miles. His girlfriend, Amanda, was asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. He eased off the accelerator when the glowing sign appeared up ahead. Last gas for 60 miles. The sign belonged to a small, faded station sitting by itself at the edge of town. The fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered weakly. A Pepsi machine leaned crookedly by the entrance, humming like an insect. The glass door had an open sign that buzzed an unnatural orange, and a single moth bumped against it again and again. Kyle pulled in, killed the engine, and for a moment just listened. The desert wind made a low, steady moan as it dragged dust across the lot. He stepped out. The air smelled faintly of oil and something else, something sweet and metallic like rusted copper. The pump screen was old-school analog, numbers behind scratched glass. He lifted the nozzle, but when he squeezed the handle, nothing happened. The lever inside clunked, but no fuel came out. He looked toward the store where a dim light burned behind the counter. Inside, the place was colder than it should have been. A bell jingled weakly above the door. Shelves stood in crooked rows, stocked with canned goods and candy that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A radio behind the counter played a faint country song distorted by static. The man standing behind the register looked like he'd been carved from the same dust that covered everything. His skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes were sunken, but his smile was friendly in a tired way. "Evening," the man said. His voice had the kind of calm that made you lower yours without realizing. "Pump giving you trouble?" "Yeah," Kyle said. "Won't start." The man nodded slowly. "They get temperamental after midnight. Try the second one, closest to the road. Sometimes the line freezes when the temperature drops." Kyle hesitated. The desert night was warm, nowhere near freezing. But he thanked the man anyway and went back outside. The second pump worked right away. The numbers began to tick, the hose rattling softly. Amanda stirred in the car and blinked. "Where are we?" "Van Horn," he said. "Almost out of gas. Be a few minutes." She nodded, rubbing her eyes, and looked toward the store. Creepy place. He smiled, but the way the light from the store flickered across the lot made him uneasy. Through the glass, he could see the old man still standing behind the counter, motionless, his hands resting flat on the surface. When the tank was full, Kyle replaced the nozzle and went back in to pay. The man took the cash, his fingers cool and dry like paper. "Quiet night for traveling," he said. "Yeah, not many cars. Most folks don't drive this stretch after midnight." The man looked toward the door as though expecting someone. "Strange things happen on the road after dark. You be careful." Kyle forced a laugh. "Sure, thanks for the warning." The man gave a faint nod. "Safe travels, son." When they pulled back onto the highway, Amanda glanced at him.
He give you the creeps too?
He's just old, Kyle said, though his stomach felt tight. Probably lonely out here. They drove another 20 miles before she fell asleep again. The road wound between low mesas, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The radio went to static no matter what station he tried. When he glanced at the dashboard clock, it flickered and reset itself to 12 mounts. Then the engine hiccuped once, twice, and the lights dimmed. "Come on," he muttered, gripping the wheel. The car jerked, then steadied. Ahead, a faint glow appeared. Headlights, maybe, or another town. But when he got closer, he realized it was the same gas station, the same crooked Pepsi machine, the same buzzing sign. He slammed the brakes, heart pounding. Amanda woke up. "What the hell, why'd you stop?" "We just left this place," he said. "We drove 20 miles. She frowned at the building. "Maybe there's another one that looks the same." He didn't answer. Every detail was identical, down to the moth tapping against the glass door. The lights above the pumps flickered in the same rhythm. He drove past it slowly, eyes locked on the windows. The man was standing behind the counter again, staring straight at them. They didn't stop. Kyle pressed the gas until the speedometer climbed past 80. He didn't look in the mirrors. The road stayed straight for miles, no exits, no turns. And when the horizon began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, his shoulders loosened. The town signs started appearing again, Sierra Blanca, Fort Hancock, and he let out a shaky breath. By morning, they were in El Paso. The sunlight made everything feel ordinary again. At a diner over coffee, Amanda searched her phone. "That gas station," she said, scrolling. "There's nothing listed at that address. Closest one's 20 miles east of Van Horn, and it closed in 2003. Burned down after the owner had a heart attack during a graveyard shift." Kyle stared at her. "What?" "Yeah, says he was alone. Customers found him the next morning." He didn't say anything. Outside, a tanker truck rumbled past, and for a second he caught his reflection in the diner window. Drawn, pale, tired. Behind him in the glass, a shape moved. For an instant, it looked like a man standing behind a counter, hands resting flat, eyes fixed on him through the glare. When Kyle blinked, it was gone. But later that night, driving back east alone after dropping Amanda at her cousin's place, he saw it again. The orange glow of a sign just beyond the next rise, flickering in the desert wind. Last gas for 60 miles, and this time he didn't stop. I grew up near Palo Pinto, a dry, quiet stretch of Texas that most people drive through without noticing. The land rolls slow there, full of low hills and mesquite trees that creak when the wind moves right. There's a hush to that part of the state, a kind of uneasy stillness that settles after sundown. My father used to say the land remembers everything that ever happened on it. That's why the wind sometimes carries voices. I thought he was joking until I spent a summer on the old Brackett Ranch, the one that sits near the edge of the Brazos River, where the grass grows in patches and the fences lean like they're tired of standing. I was 19 then, working part-time fixing barns and clearing brush for whoever would pay. The Brackett place had been empty for years, left to rot after the owner. An old cattleman named Carl Brackett died under what folks called strange circumstances. Nobody in town ever said much more than that. When I got the job, the man who hired me just said the house needed boarding up, and the old well out back needed sealing before the county came to inspect. I drove out in my beat-up Ford pickup one morning in late July, when the air was so hot it shimmered above the road. The house sat at the end of a narrow dirt trail lined with dying pecan trees. It wasn't much to look at, a sagging porch peeling white paint and a roof that seemed to bend under its own weight. The fields around it were silent except for the buzz of cicadas. The well sat behind the barn, surrounded by an old stone ring that had half collapsed. A wooden bucket lay nearby, dry rotted and split down the middle. The boards covering the well mouth were warped and gray, nailed down in a crooked pattern that didn't look sturdy enough to stop a raccoon, let alone a man. I worked until dusk, patching holes in the barn and checking the windows. The air smelled of dry hay and dust. When the sun started to dip, I decided to check the well before heading back. As I pulled off the boards, a faint chill rolled up from below. It was odd. The day had been hot enough to bake the ground, but the air rising from that well felt cool and wet. I leaned over and peered down with my flashlight. The beam stretched maybe 20 feet before hitting water that reflected back like black glass. For a moment, I thought I heard something moving down there. a slow ripple or scrape, but when I listened harder there was only silence. I told myself it was just the echo of my own movement. The next day I came back with cement and a wooden frame to seal the well properly. I spent the morning mixing the cement in a wheelbarrow, working under that blazing sun until my shirt stuck to my back. I remember taking a break around noon, sitting on the porch steps with a bottle of warm water when I thought I heard a faint knocking sound. It came from behind the barn. At first I figured it was the wind or some loose panel banging, but the sound had a rhythm to it. 3 short knocks, then silence. I called out, thinking maybe someone had pulled up, but the driveway was empty. The knocking stopped as soon as I spoke. When I went to check, I found nothing. The barn was quiet, just the smell of old hay and oil. I walked around the back and froze when I saw the boards I'd pulled off the well lying neatly beside it, stacked in a pile like someone had set them there carefully. I hadn't done that. The hole yawned open again, dark and wet at the bottom. I felt that same cold air rising from it, brushing against my face. My first thought was that a stray dog or coyote had moved them, but the boards were heavy and there were no paw prints in the dust. That night I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. I told my friend Mark, who worked construction with me, and he laughed it off, said maybe some kids were messing around. Still, he agreed to come out with me the next evening to help finish sealing it. We got there just before sunset, the sky orange and heavy. As we worked, the wind died completely and the sound of our shovels seemed too loud. Mark was mixing the last batch of cement when he said he heard something. I turned off the mixer and we both stood there listening. From deep in the well came a faint sound like water moving, then a voice. It wasn't clear at first, just a low murmur. Mark looked at me and whispered, "Did you hear that?" The voice rose again, distinct this time. It was soft and drawn out like a person calling from far away, but the words didn't make sense. It wasn't English, or at least not any English I recognized. It had a wet, gurgling tone to it like someone speaking through water. The hair on my arm stood up. Mark leaned over the edge with the flashlight, calling down, "Hello? Anyone down there?" The echo of his voice came back a second later, warped and delayed. But there was something else mixed in with it, a second echo that didn't match the rhythm. It repeated his words just a split second off, but wrong somehow. It didn't sound like his voice. It was higher and wet, as if someone else was trying to mimic him from the dark. He stepped back fast, muttering that it must be the acoustics. We covered the well again and decided to leave the ceiling for the morning. That night I dreamed of water. I was standing in a shallow pool, the surface black and still, when something touched my ankle, cold and smooth like a hand. I woke drenched in sweat. My clock said 3:12 a.m. The room was silent except for a faint dripping sound coming from somewhere near the window. When I turned on the lamp, I saw a dark wet spot forming on the floorboards beneath the window frame. I touched it. The water was icy cold. I didn't sleep after that. When we returned the next day, the boards were off again. This time, one of them was lying several feet away, half buried in the dirt. I told Mark I didn't care if the county fined us. I was finishing the job that day. We set the frame and poured the cement until the well was completely sealed. By the time we finished, the sun was gone, and a low mist had started to crawl across the fields. As we packed up, Mark froze, pointing toward the house. In one of the upstairs windows, a light flickered. It was brief, like a candle flame, but I could have sworn I saw a shape behind the glass. A figure standing perfectly still. We left without checking it out. Neither of us said a word on the drive back to town. The next week, when I came to collect payment, the county supervisor told me the Brackett Ranch had burned the night before. They said it must have been lightning, though there hadn't been a storm. The house, the barn, everything, gone. Months later, I was sitting at the bar in Mineral Wells when I overheard 2 old men talking about the Brackett place. One of them said his uncle used to work there back in the 60s. Said the well wasn't just a well. It was built over a natural sinkhole that connected to a network of underground caverns. He said the family used to hear voices coming from it on summer nights, like something calling up from below. When Brackett's wife died, he had the well boarded, but after that, the cattle started dying and the ranch hands left one by one. Brackett was found one morning sitting beside the well, eyes open, face pale as chalk. They said there was no sign of struggle, no wound, but his hands were soaking wet, and when the sheriff tried to lift him, water poured from his mouth like he'd drowned. I didn't go back there. I heard later that the county fenced the whole area off, claiming the ground was unstable. Still, Sometimes when I drive through Palo Pinto late at night, I can see the outline of the hills where the ranch used to sit. And if I roll down my window and listen close, when the wind is still and the cicadas quiet down, I swear I can hear it. A faint dripping sound, like water echoing up from deep underground. Sometimes it stops, and for just a second there's silence. Then, so faint I can almost believe I imagined it, comes the sound of something answering back. The rain had been falling for hours the night I got lost along Miller Creek Road. Out that way, where Llano County's hills turn into endless brush and limestone ridges, GPS might as well be a rumor. The road curved through thick oak woods and past stretches of barbed wire fence where old signs leaned like drunks, warning trespassers to keep out. I'd been driving from Austin toward Mason, taking the back roads because I wanted to clear my head after a fight with my girlfriend. I didn't realize until later that I had drifted far past where anyone sane would still call it civilization. The highway lights had long since disappeared, and the only glow came from my headlights cutting through the rain. Then I saw the house. It sat back from the road behind a collapsed wire gate, its outline barely visible through the curtain of water. The roof sagged like a hat left in the sun too long. The windows were tall, thin things that looked more like open mouths than glass panes. But what made me slow down wasn't the ruin of it. It was the light. A dull red glow shimmered in the top left window, like someone had set a lantern inside and pulled a shade over it. At first I thought it was a reflection of my brake lights, so I turned them off. The glow stayed. It even seemed to pulse once, faint but unmistakable, like it was breathing. Curiosity is a disease some people never shake, and I've been sick with it all my life. So I pulled over onto the mud shoulder and rolled the window down. The smell hit me first. Wet cedar, rust, and something faintly metallic. I don't know why I thought I heard movement in there, but I did. Something slow, deliberate. I called out, feeling ridiculous. "Hello, you okay in there?" The rain swallowed my voice, but then a shape moved behind the glass. I swear to God I saw it. A pale face, eyes like black marbles, staring down through that glowing window. I blinked and it was gone. I should have driven away. Any rational person would have. But I put the truck in park, grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the downpour. The ground was slick and red with mud, the kind that clings to your boots like it doesn't want to let go. The closer I got, the quieter it seemed to get, until all I could hear was the drip of water off the trees and the tick of my engine cooling. The air felt heavier near that place, like it was full of old breath. I pushed open the gate, which creaked like a dying animal, and started up the path. The house looked older up close. Maybe late 1800s. 2 stories, limestone foundation, wooden porch eaten by termites and time. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards gave under my weight with a sound like muffled crying. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily. The smell inside was worse, damp wood, mildew, and something faintly sweet like rotting fruit. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching cobwebs thick as gauze and walls stripped bare of wallpaper. Every few feet, the beam flickered, though the batteries were fresh. I called out again, quieter this time. "Hello? You hurt or need help?" Nothing, just the sound of water dripping somewhere deeper inside. Then a faint creak from above. I shone the light toward the staircase. The second-floor landing was swallowed in shadow, but I could see faint footprints in the dust going up. They were small, bare, and wet. I remember thinking that someone must have just walked there. That meant someone was still inside, so I followed. Each step groaned under me as I climbed. About halfway up, I started hearing it, a soft tapping, rhythmic like fingertips against glass. It was coming from the room with the glowing window. The sound stopped when I reached the top step. The door to the room was slightly open, and the red light pulsed faintly through the crack. I don't know why, but I whispered, "Hello?" before pushing the door open. There was no one there. The room was empty except for an old iron bed frame and a broken dresser. The walls were stained dark with moisture, and the window was fogged from the rain. The light came from somewhere behind the glass, deep red like the color of a dying sunset. I went closer and wiped my sleeve across the window. Outside, all I saw was my truck parked by the road, and then, just for an instant, my reflection shifted. There was someone standing right behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The room was empty. But the smell had changed, stronger now, like rust and something burning. The air buzzed with static. I looked back at the window and the reflection was wrong again. The red glow wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the glass itself, spreading like blood through water. Shapes began to form in the glow. Faces, I think, pressed against the other side, mouths open in silent screams. My body moved before my brain caught up. I ran, the staircase seemed longer going down. Every step I took, the house creaked like it was echoing me. When I hit the front hall, I caught sight of something in the corner. An old family photo nailed crooked to the wall, half faded by time. The people in it looked like they'd been cut from another century. A man, a woman, and 2 children. The father's face had been burned away by something. The rest stared at the camera with glassy, hollow eyes. Behind them, faint but clear, was that same red glow shining through a window. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour. I ran to my truck and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice. When the engine finally turned over, I gunned it down the road without looking back. But after a few seconds, something in my headlights made me slam on the brakes. There, standing right in the middle of Miller Creek Road, was a child, small, barefoot, wearing what looked like a nightgown soaked through with rain. Her hair hung over her face. I honked, shouted, but she didn't move. I got out again, cursing myself for even caring. When I walked closer, she lifted her head and I saw her eyes, completely black, shining like oil. Then she smiled, and the sound that came out of her mouth wasn't laughter. It was the same tapping I'd heard upstairs, echoing in the storm. I stumbled backward and ran for the truck, slamming the door and speeding off until the house disappeared in my mirrors. By the time I reached the highway, the rain had stopped. The world was quiet again. I pulled over at a gas station in Llano, still shaking. The attendant, an older man with a white beard, noticed my state and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd gotten lost near Miller Creek Road, near that old house with the glowing window. His face went pale. "Son," he said, leaning on the counter, "that house burned down 30 years ago. Lightning hit it one night, killed the whole family inside. Folks around here say the place still shows itself when it rains. You're lucky you didn't go inside." I didn't correct him. I just nodded and left, though I couldn't stop replaying the smell, the light, and that photo nailed to the wall. I still had mud on my boots when I got home, caked thick and red. I tried to wash it off the next morning, but it wouldn't come off right away. It stained the water pink like blood, and when I emptied my pockets before bed, I found something that didn't belong there. A small old-fashioned key, rusted, with the initials EM carved into it. I never went back to Miller Creek Road, but sometimes, when the storms roll in from the west, I'll wake up and see a faint red light flickering in the reflection of my window. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that quiet, patient tapping, like someone waiting for me to come home. In Lufkin, there's a small elementary school off Chestnut Street, tucked behind the pines where the air always smells like wet bark and chalk dust, the kind of place that looks peaceful enough from the road. Low red brick, faded blue doors, a playground that hasn't changed since the 70s, but if you linger too long at the chain link fence, you'll notice the swing set. There's one swing that always moves. No wind, no birds, no kids. Just that faint squeak and the steady back and forth motion like someone invisible is still pushing off the ground. Locals don't talk about it much anymore. Not after what happened in 1998. The boy's name was Christopher Bell, though everyone called him Kit. He was 8, quiet, and strange in the way that makes teachers whisper in the break room. He never smiled for pictures, and he had this odd habit of staring at things too long, like he was watching the world replay on a loop. His mother was young and always working at the Piggly Wiggly on Timberland Drive, and his father was gone before he could walk. Kit didn't have friends, not really, but he loved the playground. The swings were his escape. Every day after recess ended, the teachers had to call his name twice before he'd stop swinging and come back inside. It was late spring when he vanished. The kind of day where the heat feels alive, pressing down through the smell of melting asphalt. The school had just put in new gravel around the jungle gym, and at recess the kids ran wild while the teachers sat under the shade of the one surviving oak tree. Kit was swinging, as always, counting under his breath. He did that a lot, counted to 100, then started again. Some of the kids said he was timing something. When the bell rang, everyone filed inside except Kit. A teacher called out to him. He didn't answer. They thought he was being stubborn. That kind of quiet rebellion kids sometimes have. But when she walked over, he wasn't there. Just the empty swing still moving. Slow and steady. They searched the field, the bathrooms, the woods behind the baseball diamond. Nothing. The police were called within the hour, and the news vans came that night. They drained the pond, checked every house within 5 miles. No trace, no blood, no footprints, not even a piece of his backpack. It was like he had been erased. Classes resumed a week later, though half the kids stopped coming. Some parents transferred their children to other schools. Teachers whispered about quitting. But life in Lufkin goes on. By the next semester, the playground was full again. The kids played tag and kickball, though no one ever touched the swings. Especially not the one on the far left, because that swing never stopped. The janitor, an old man named Rayford who'd been there 30 years, swore he chained them all up every night. He said he'd walk the length of the fence before locking up, and every time that one swing would be loose, rocking gently, even when the others were still. He told the principal about it, but they laughed him off. Then one morning he didn't show up for work. They found his keys by the slide and his flashlight under the swing set still on, beam pointing at nothing. Kids started saying they heard Kit. Whispered stories spread that if you went to the fence at noon, when the sun was directly overhead, and the cicadas screamed loud enough to drown out everything else, you could hear the gravel crunch. Soft footsteps circling the swing. Some said you'd hear breathing, like a child catching his breath after running. One boy, a 5th grader named Darren, decided to prove it was just talk. His friends dared him to hop the fence during lunch. Teachers were inside and the heat shimmered off the blacktop. Darren climbed over, walked across the gravel, and grabbed the moving swing to stop it. The moment his hand touched the chain, the air went dead quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Then, as he told it later through chattering teeth, the metal burned his palm like it had been sitting in fire. He let go and fell backward. When the teachers found him minutes later, he was staring up at the sky, mumbling, "He's still here." He never went back to that school. Over the years, they tried everything to quiet the rumors. They replaced the swing set, paved over the gravel, even brought in a priest once. For a while it worked. Until the following August, when the new principal decided to reopen the playground for a back-to-school event. Parents came with lawn chairs and snow cones. Someone brought a speaker and played country music. Kids ran wild again and the air felt almost normal. Then a mother screamed. Her daughter had wandered toward the swings. People turned to look just in time to see the girl talking to empty air, nodding like she was answering questions. The swing beside her started moving, slow and deliberate. Not the wind. Everyone there swore the air was perfectly still. The girl giggled, said, "He says he's been waiting for me." Then she froze, eyes wide, and began to cry. When her mother reached her, the girl whispered, "He can't leave." After that, they tore down the playground completely, leveled the dirt, planted grass. The district built a parking lot over it 2 years later. But sometimes, when the heat rolls in heavy and the afternoon light turns that sickly yellow, teachers say they still hear it. The faint creak of metal chains, rhythmic and lonely, somewhere beneath the blacktop. Maintenance crews claim the asphalt always buckles in the same spot every summer, right where the old swing used to be. And the security cameras? They've caught things, not often but enough. A shape like a small boy, blurred by motion, standing at the far edge of the lot around noon where no shadow should fall. Sometimes you can see the shimmer of air beside him, the faint sway of something invisible, keeping time with the wind that isn't there. If you ever drive past Chestnut Elementary in Lufkin and the sun's hanging high, look toward the playground. You might see nothing but grass and asphalt and the ghost shimmer of heat. But if you wait long enough, you'll notice it. The soft, deliberate sway of an unseen swing. And if you listen closely, past the cicadas and the hum of the air, you might hear a small voice counting. 97, 98, 99, then silence. And if you don't leave right then, you might hear the chains start to move again. In the thick woods outside Hemphill, Texas, where the pines grow so close they whisper against each other when the wind picks up, there's an old clearing people don't like to talk about. It's where the Hemphill Lumber Company once stood, a sprawling sawmill operation that fed the town for decades until the night it burned in 1963. They say it started just after midnight, when the night shift was halfway through loading timber. Some blamed faulty machinery, Others blamed sabotage, but the official report listed unknown causes. The blaze consumed everything: the main mill, the loading docks, the rail cars lined with yellow pine. It was so hot that iron bolts melted into the dirt. 12 men never made it out. When I moved to Hemp Hill 3 summers ago, I rented a small place near 6 Mile Creek, not far from the mill ruins. I didn't know the full story then. I only knew that every summer around late July, locals claimed to see smoke rising from the pines. I thought it was a campfire or a controlled burn. Then one humid night I saw it for myself. A gray column rising in the distance, flickering with a faint orange glow, like a ghost of flame that refused to die. Curiosity got the better of me. I took my truck down the old logging road, a rutted trail swallowed by weeds and saplings, and stopped where the gravel ended. The smell hit first. It wasn't just wood smoke. It was something older, sourer, like tar and burned oil. The air shimmered even though the night was cool. And then I heard it. A rhythmic whine, faint at first, like machinery starting up somewhere deep in the trees. The sound grew clearer, the grind of saw blades cutting through timber. My first thought was that someone was running a portable mill out here, maybe salvaging old wood. But then I realized the sound was layered. There were voices, men shouting over the noise, the clatter of chains, the bark of a foreman giving orders. It was coming from a clearing that, by all logic, should have been empty. When I stepped through the pines, the air was thick with haze. The ground glowed with patches of red like embers buried just below the soil. I could make out the skeletal remains of the mill, a few charred beams and rusted saw teeth scattered like bones. And then something shifted in the haze. Shapes, faint outlines of men moving through the smoke. Their movements were steady, mechanical. One bent to lift a log that wasn't there. Another wiped sweat from a face that shimmered like heat over pavement. I stood frozen. My brain was trying to file it under some trick of the eyes, but then one of them turned toward me. He was close, 20 feet, maybe less. His eyes were pits of black ash. His mouth moved like he was calling something out, but the words were lost under the steady grind of invisible machinery. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots, a deep rumble that seemed to come from underground. Then I heard my name. It wasn't shouted. It was whispered right beside my ear, a low, rasping voice that cracked like dry wood splitting. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the sound of the saw whining higher, faster until it became a scream. I bolted back to my truck, tearing through the brush, and didn't stop until the road straightened out by the creek. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the smoke was gone. The glow, too. Just a quiet stretch of trees under a pale moon. I told myself it had to be something explainable. Maybe old methane vents igniting under the right conditions. Maybe sound carrying from the highway in some weird acoustic way. I tried to let it go. But that same week, when I stopped at the Hemp Hill Cafe, an older man sitting by the window asked where I was staying. When I told him near 6 Mile, he gave me a long, tired look. "You seen it yet?" he asked. I didn't answer. He nodded like he already knew. They always call the new ones first. Every few years, when the ground gets hot enough, the names start again. I asked what he meant. He stirred his coffee, eyes on the steam. "They call out the ones who never left," he said. "And sometimes they call the ones who don't belong." After that, I started hearing the noises again, even when the air was still. The saw, the hammering, faint but constant, usually just before dawn. One night, I woke to the smell of smoke seeping through the window screens. My phone showed 2:17 a.m. I looked outside and the tree line was glowing red again. This time I recorded it. I still have the video. It shows nothing but darkness and a shimmer of light, but the audio is clear. In the background, over the hum of insects, you can hear the saws turning, and near the end a voice calls my name. Not once, but 3 times. I played it for my neighbor the next morning. She went pale. "Turn that off," she said. "You shouldn't have gone out there." She told me about her uncle, a foreman at the old mill who died in the fire. His name was Everett Cole. In the months before the fire, he'd complained about strange electrical surges and hearing his name whispered while he worked alone at night. The day before the blaze, he told her mother he smelled smoke in the walls. I asked if she thought it was haunted. She said something that stuck with me. Haunted means something's left. What's out there didn't leave. It stayed burning. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy and damp, the way it gets before a thunderstorm. I sat by the window watching the treetops sway in the dark, when a faint orange light bloomed through the pines again. Only this time it wasn't distant, it was moving closer. I could hear it too. The metallic screech of a saw blade, the crack of splitting timber, footsteps on gravel. When I looked down the dirt road, I saw figures walking out of the smoke. Not solid, but not gone either. Men in torn work clothes, their skin gray with ash. They carried axes, chains, and something else I didn't want to recognize. One of them lifted his head, and I saw his face was blackened to the bone. He opened his mouth, and though his jaw didn't move right, I heard it clear as anything. My name, drawn out like it had been dragged through the coals. I ran, through the back door, across the yard, into the woods behind the property. I didn't stop until I hit the creek. When I looked back, the light from the mill was blazing again, the kind of orange that makes you think the whole world's on fire. In the morning, the woods were quiet. No smoke, no footprints, just a faint smell of burnt pine that lingered for days. But something had changed. The ground near the creek was blackened in a straight line, like a mark burned into the soil. Right through the middle of it was a piece of old iron. One of the mill's saw teeth, rusted and sharp. Every summer since then, the fires return. Always the same week. The locals close their windows and pretend not to hear the voices. But I know better. I've heard the names they call. They start with the dead, then they move on to the living. And when the wind shifts just right, if you stand quiet enough by the creek, you can still hear the saw start up again deep in the woods, cutting through more than just wood. That's when I leave town for a while. Because each year when the smoke starts to rise, the voices get clearer. And lately they don't just call my name. They tell me to come back to work. When the sun starts to slide behind the hills around Glen Rose, the Paluxy River takes on a strange kind of silence. The cicadas hush first, then the breeze slows, and all that's left is the murmur of shallow water curling around smooth stones. Locals say that's when you can hear her, the woman in the river. She hums old gospel hymns no one remembers anymore. They say if you stand too close to the bridge at dusk, you'll start humming along without meaning to. It started for me one October evening. I'd driven out from Fort Worth for a photography project, chasing the kind of golden hour light you only find in small Texas towns. Glen Rose had that sleepy, nostalgic charm, the diner with faded Coca-Cola signs, the courthouse square that hadn't changed since the 1920s, and the river, slow and green, winding under the low stone bridge on County Road 1004. I parked my truck near the edge, camera slung over my shoulder, and waited for that perfect moment when the sun kissed the treetops. I remember hearing it before I saw anything. A low, steady hum, so faint I thought it was the wind in the reeds. The melody was familiar, but just out of reach, like something half-remembered from a dream. I leaned over the rail, listening. That's when I saw her, a pale figure standing knee-deep in the river, her dress floating around her like smoke. She was turned away, her head slightly bowed, her hair drifting in the current. I called out, thinking maybe she needed help. The river can be deceptive around there. The limestone drops off fast. But she didn't move. She just kept humming. I tried again, louder this time, but my voice seemed to die in the air before it reached her. Then she stopped. The sound cut off, and the ripples around her froze, as if the whole river was holding its breath. Slowly, she turned her head. Her face was wrong. Not monstrous or bloody, just wrong. Pale, too pale, and her eyes, they weren't eyes at all, more like empty reflections of the river itself, dull and moving and endless. I stumbled back, and in that instant she was gone. The water rippled once, and there was nothing but the faint smell of wet earth. I drove back to town shaken, but trying to reason it away. Maybe I'd seen a trick of light or a reflection or someone playing a prank. I didn't tell anyone, not that night. But the next morning I went back. I told myself I just wanted to see the light again for my project, but deep down, I needed to know if what I saw was real. An older man at the gas station saw my camera and asked if I was shooting the river. When I told him yes, he grunted and said, "You best keep your distance from that bridge come sundown. Folks say the river still remembers her." I pressed him for details, and he told me the story. Back in the 1930s, when the drought hit hardest, a woman named Ruth Ann lived out near Glen Rose with her husband and 2 small boys. They were poor but proud, kept to themselves, and came into town only for church on Sundays. Then one summer, her husband left. Some say he went to find work in Waco. Others claim he ran off with another woman. Weeks passed and no word came. The wells dried up, the crops failed, and Ruth Ann lost her mind. They say one night she carried her boys down to the river, singing hymns as she went. Neighbors heard her voice drifting through the trees, soft and sad. By morning, she and the boys were gone. When they found them downstream, her arms were wrapped tight around both children, her face pressed into the mud as if she'd tried to breathe the river itself. The preacher wouldn't bury her on church ground. They say he called it an abomination. After that, people started hearing the singing at dusk. Sometimes it came from under the bridge, sometimes from the reeds by the old ferry crossing. Always the same tune, always the same hour. A few folks swore they saw her walking along the shallows, her hands brushing the surface like she was searching for something she'd lost. I should have listened to that old man, but that night I went back again, determined to catch it on film. The air felt thicker, the kind of stillness that sits heavy in your chest. I set up my tripod on the bank and aimed it toward the bridge. The water was dark, reflecting the last of the purple sky. At first there was nothing. Then came the humming, faint just like before. It slid through the air, sweet and low, and I felt that strange pull again, like the sound was coming from inside me instead of across the river. My fingers trembled on the camera. Through the lens I saw movement, ripples spreading outward from beneath the bridge. She rose from the water like a breath exhaled. Not fast, not sudden. Just there, forming out of mist and shadow. Her dress clung to her frame, the fabric dripping like melted wax. She began walking toward the bank, still humming, her voice growing clearer. I should have run, but I kept filming, then my camera died. Just shut off. I checked the battery in full. The screen flickered, showing a frozen frame of the river and then static. The humming stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard a splash, closer this time. I turned, and there she was, standing 10 feet away on the rocks. Up close, her face looked even stranger. Not rotten, not ghostly, but blurred, like she was made of smoke trying to remember how to be human. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then I realized she was still humming, only now the sound wasn't coming from her lips. It was coming from the water. The surface rippled, and I saw shapes beneath it. 2 small forms, hands reaching up, eyes open and black. I stumbled backward, tripping over my tripod, and fell hard against the gravel. When I looked up, she was gone, but the river was moving wrong, swirling against the current like it was alive. I don't remember driving back to town. I just remember waking up in my motel room, soaked and shivering, my camera sitting on the table. I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, but when I turned it on, the video was still there. Only it wasn't what I'd filmed. It showed the bridge, the water, the same scene, but I wasn't behind the camera. I was in the frame, standing on the bank, staring blankly into the river. Behind me, just barely visible, the pale figure hovered at the edge of the water, her hands resting on my shoulders. I left Glen Rose that morning. Haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night when I'm editing photos, I'll catch it again. That faint hum threading through my speakers, growing louder until it fills the room. And if I look long enough into any dark reflection, a window, a puddle, the screen of my camera, I can see the river moving behind me and something pale and patient waiting just beneath the surface. Under the flat glare of a lone sodium lamp, the Gaines County rest stop sat halfway between nowhere and nothing. Westbound truckers pulled off there to stretch their legs, smoke a quick cigarette, or close their eyes for an hour before pushing on toward El Paso. The building was a low brick rectangle with restrooms on one end, vending machines on the other, and a stretch of cracked asphalt that used to be the picnic area before the state stopped maintaining it. Beyond that lay miles of mesquite scrub and wind-blasted soil, the kind that turns orange in your headlights and smells faintly of dust and old bones. I was driving the night shift back then, hauling produce from San Angelo to the border warehouses. It was a monotonous route, long stretches of empty highway, and I usually tuned the CB to channel 19 to listen to the chatter. That's how I first heard about the lights. Some trucker out of Lubbock, voice cutting through the static, said he'd been followed all the way from the rest stop. Said there was a pair of headlights in his mirrors that never got closer and never fell back, no matter how fast he went. I laughed at the time, thought he was half asleep or seeing things. But then another driver chimed in, swore he'd had the same experience 2 nights before. After that, it became something of a ghost story between the westbound drivers. The Gaines County taillights, they called them. I didn't think much of it until one night in early October when my schedule put me through that stretch around midnight. I remember the time clearly because my dash clock had just flipped over from 12:02. I was running low on caffeine, so I decided to stop at the rest area for a soda. When I pulled in, there wasn't another vehicle in sight. The place looked even more deserted than usual. The vending machine lights flickered like dying fireflies, and something about the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening. Not a sound except the ticking of the cooling engine and the wind whispering through the scrub. Inside the restroom, the fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and the whole place smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. Someone had carved a crude cross into the metal mirror frame. When I stepped back outside, the highway stretched out in both directions, an endless ribbon of black. That's when I noticed the lights. Far down the eastbound lane, 2 headlights appeared just above the horizon line. They were steady, bright, moving slow. I figured it was another truck coming through, so I finished my soda and climbed back into the cab. By the time I started the engine, those lights had drawn closer, but not enough. They should have been right on top of me, but they stayed the same distance away. I pulled out onto the road, the tires humming on the asphalt, and checked my mirrors. The lights followed, always the same distance back, maybe 100 yards. I pushed up to 60, then 70. The light stayed. I got on the CB, half joking, half nervous. "Anybody westbound past Gaines County got a read on a tailgater?" Silence. Then a hiss of static. "Don't look too long," a voice said, faint as if it were coming from another channel. "Don't let it catch your eyes." The transmission broke up right after that. I tried calling again, but nothing. By then the road was curving through the low hills, and I told myself it was just a reflection, maybe my own headlights bouncing off a sign somewhere. But when I crested a rise, the reflection theory died because there were no signs. No other vehicles, just the endless dark behind me, and those lights still hovering there, twin white eyes in the mirror. After 10 miles, they began to flicker, like something passing through fog that wasn't there. I kept driving, fingers locked on the wheel, eyes forward. When I finally dared a glance in the mirror again, the lights were gone. I told myself they'd turned off onto a side road, though there weren't any for 30 miles. The next morning, I stopped at a truck stop in Seminole and told a couple of old hands about what I'd seen. One of them, a grizzled man with a bandaged thumb, just nodded slowly. "That stretch has bad dirt," he said. "They built that rest stop right over where a car went off the road in '72. Whole family burned up. People still find glass out there after a hard rain." The other driver said he'd seen the lights too years back. Said they don't just follow trucks, sometimes they wait. "If you ever see them standing still on the shoulder," he told me, "you keep driving. Don't stop no matter what you hear." I tried to laugh it off, but after that night I took a different route whenever I could. Still, a few months later I was forced through that same stretch again. It was mid-January, a bitter cold wind sweeping across the plains, my rig's heater barely keeping up. The rest stoplights were visible from almost a mile out, a faint orange smudge in the dark. When I passed it, I noticed a car parked at the far end, near the picnic tables. A white sedan, engine running, lights off. As I drew even, I saw someone standing in front of it. A woman, tall, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress. Her head was tilted slightly as if she were listening for something. I slowed instinctively, my foot easing off the gas, but every instinct screamed not to stop. I pressed the pedal again and picked up speed. As I did, the headlights came alive behind me, bright and sudden, flooding the cab with white light. I slammed the accelerator, engine roaring, but the distance in the mirrors never changed. The lights stayed right there, perfectly steady, like they were painted onto the glass. My radio went to static. My dashboard clock froze at 12:17, and for one sickening moment I thought I could see the reflection of a face in the mirror. Not mine, but something pale, hollow-eyed, its mouth moving soundlessly. Then everything blinked out. When I came to, the truck was parked on the shoulder 10 miles west of the rest stop. Engine idling, radio silent. I had no memory of stopping. My hands were locked so tightly around the wheel that my knuckles had gone white. The clock read 2:03. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I drove the rest of the way in silence, heart hammering, and didn't speak of it again for a long time. A few months later, I passed through the area during the day and noticed the rest stop had been closed. Barricades across the entrance, signs warning of structural issues. But the building was still there, the same low brick shape, windows boarded up. Out of curiosity, I pulled onto the shoulder and looked out across the lot. There were scorch marks on the concrete. The local paper ran a brief piece about it not long after. Some drifter had been found burned inside an old sedan parked behind the restrooms. They said it was probably suicide, but no one could explain how the fire had started. There were no matches, no gas can, no accelerant residue, just ash and 2 melted headlight bulbs lying side by side in the dirt. The story faded quick, like everything out there eventually does. But every now and then, when I tune into the CB on that same frequency, I still hear whispers in the static. Some nights, a voice cuts through clear as day, tired and trembling, saying the same thing over and over. They're still behind me, still the same distance. And when I glance in my mirrors on those long West Texas highways, I swear sometimes I can see them too. Those cold, white lights, floating just far enough back to keep me guessing whether they're real or not. On quiet nights, the wind runs soft over the cemetery on the hill above Clifton, rattling the dry grass and knocking against the wrought iron fence that borders the graves. There are no street lights that reach this far, only the dull orange glow from town a mile away and the soft whir of cars on Highway 6. The cemetery sits beside an old Methodist church that hasn't held service in 20 years. And when people in Clifton talk about strange things happening there, they always start with the same sentence. Sometimes, you can hear the bell. No one has ever found that bell. Not buried beneath the stones, not hidden inside the church ruins, not hanging from a tree. But folks swear they hear it toll at night, slow, hollow, and distant, like it's coming from under the ground. And every time it rings, someone in town dies. It's been happening for generations. Long enough that even the skeptical ones lower their voices when they talk about it. When I moved to Clifton, I didn't believe any of it. I'd come from Waco to take a job teaching history at the high school, and small-town legends were something I'd always found charming, not frightening. But within a few months, I began to see how seriously people took the story. One night at the bar, when the rain was thick and the lightning was crawling across the plains, I mentioned the bell to a few locals. The room went quiet. A man at the counter, thin, gray-haired, still wearing his feed store cap, turned to me and said, "Best not to joke about that, son. My brother heard it in '97, and 3 days later he was dead." He didn't say how. None of them ever did. I started asking questions anyway. The librarian, Mrs. Copeland, had a file on it. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed death notices, a few scribbled notes from pastors who'd served the church back when the bell supposedly hung in the steeple. But there were gaps. The bell was never photographed. No record showed when it was removed or if it had ever been there. The earliest mention I found was from 1891, a short article in the Clifton Record about an unholy sound disturbing the town. The more I dug, the more people stopped talking to me. They'd cross the street when I waved. The pastor at the Baptist church politely told me to leave the dead alone. Even my landlord, an old woman named Ruth, warned me not to invite trouble. She said the bell only rang for those who listened too hard for it. Still, I couldn't let it go. One Friday evening in early November, I decided to visit the cemetery myself. The air smelled of cedar and burnt leaves, and the horizon glowed faintly red from a brush fire miles away. I parked near the gate, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking among the graves. Some were marble and new, others so eroded you could barely read the names. I remember how silent it was. No crickets, no wind, just the creak of the fence as it swayed slightly in the night. I passed a row of stones marked from the early 1900s and stopped near the oldest part of the yard, where a gnarled oak split the earth beside a cracked angel statue. I stood there a while reading the names: Foster, Dawes, Holloway. There were depressions in the soil that looked like sinkholes, and I noticed one of them was shaped oddly round, like something had once been buried there and removed. Then from somewhere beneath my feet came a low metallic sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the slow dragging toll of a bell. Once, twice, then silence. My flashlight flickered and I felt a rush of cold air crawl up my spine. The sound hadn't echoed like something above ground. It had vibrated through the dirt, dull and heavy. I crouched down, pressed my ear against the grass, and listened. Nothing. But my heartbeat had gone strange, almost sinking to the rhythm I thought I'd heard. I left soon after that. The next morning, the sheriff's truck was parked outside the gas station. I overheard him talking to someone about an accident out on Route 219. A local farmer named Billy Dawes had been found in his field, dead of a heart attack. The name made my skin prickle. It was the same as the one carved into that cracked headstone beneath the oak. That was the first time I considered leaving Clifton, but curiosity's a curse and mine was worse than most. I went back a week later, this time with a shovel. I told myself it was research, that I wanted to disprove the myth, to find a piece of old iron or an underground cistern that could explain the sound. The soil was soft where I'd heard the bell. After 20 minutes of digging, I hit something solid. Metal, but not flat, curved. I brushed away the dirt until I could see more. It wasn't a bell, not really. It was the rusted rim of a barrel. Inside it was packed with clay and roots, but as I dug around, I felt the shape of something else, smaller and heavier. When I finally pulled it free, I realized it was a clapper, the swinging piece from inside a bell. I don't know how long I stared at it, but when I finally looked up, I saw someone standing on the edge of the cemetery road, a woman pale, dressed in black, watching me. I blinked and she was gone. I put the clapper in my trunk and drove home, my hands trembling. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Around midnight, as I was dozing off, I heard it, the bell. It sounded closer this time, clearer, tolling 3 times before fading into the dark. The next morning, Ruth didn't answer her door. The sheriff's deputy found her sitting in her recliner, television still on, a half-finished cup of tea beside her. They said it looked peaceful, but I knew better. I hadn't told anyone about what I'd found, but I felt certain now that it wasn't coincidence. The bell had rung for her. I decided to bury the clapper again, to put it back where I found it. But when I opened the trunk, it was gone. In its place was a smear of red dirt and the faintest impression of a hand. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. I drove out of town for a few days, stayed with a colleague in Waco. But the third night there, while I was lying awake in the guest room, I heard the faint chime again, distant but clear. It came from beneath the floorboards. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When I returned to Clifton, the town was different, quieter, almost hollow. The church had collapsed during a storm, and the cemetery was closed off by yellow tape. The sheriff told me they'd found something strange after the ground gave way. An old pit lined with bricks about 10 feet deep, filled with water and bones. At the bottom, half buried in silt, was a massive iron bell. They hauled it out with a crane, but it cracked in half when they set it down. The sound it made wasn't like any bell I'd ever heard. It was too long, too low, almost like the earth itself was groaning. Since then, the deaths have stopped. At least that's what people say. But I still hear it sometimes when the wind blows over the hill and the rain starts to fall. I moved out of town years ago. Yet on stormy nights, I can still feel that vibration deep under my feet, like something calling through the dirt. Maybe they silenced it when they broke the bell. Maybe they didn't. Because lately, when the thunder rolls across the plains, I can hear something faint beneath it. Metal on metal, ringing softly, counting down. In the summer heat outside Presidio, where the desert turns everything the same dull shade of dust, a small silver trailer appeared one morning off the highway. No one saw it being hauled in, but by the next evening, lights glowed inside it like a lantern half buried in sand. The locals talked about it at the gas station and over beer at the cantina, how the family that moved in kept to themselves, how their curtains never opened, how the lights never went off. Even through the worst of the July heat, that trailer stayed lit every night, humming faintly like an insect nest in the dark. I first noticed it coming home from the oil fields after a late shift. It sat maybe a quarter-mile off Farm Road 170, behind a dry creek bed where nothing but thorn brush grew. The porch light was so bright it lit the ground in front like daylight, but no one was outside. And the air had that heavy electric stillness that makes you feel watched. Every night for weeks I'd see that glow from the highway, same as everyone else. Some folks said the family were nomads, some kind of travelers who'd been through Big Bend before. Others said they were drifters hiding from something. But they didn't bother anyone, and no one bothered them. Around mid-August, the lights went out. It was the talk of town for days. People joked that maybe they'd finally left, maybe the power got cut, maybe they just couldn't stand the heat. But when the days turned into a week and still no one saw them leave, the joke stopped. The mail carrier said the box by the road still had their name, the Darnells, written in fading black marker. She said there was no forwarding address, no pickup, nothing. When Sheriff Harlan went to check, he found the front steps covered in sand. The door shut but unlocked, and inside, everything perfectly neat. Dishes stacked, beds made, half-full glasses of water on the counter, all gone stale with dust. He said it smelled like static inside. That's how he described it, static. The air was dry as chalk, but the smell was sharp, metallic, like the inside of a broken radio. There was no food rotting, no sign of struggle, no blood, just absence, heavy and thick. The sheriff said he heard something faint too when he stood real still. A low whine, like an electric hum buried deep in the walls. When he tried to find the source, it stopped. I went out there a few nights after with my friend Kenny. He'd been drinking and said he wanted to see it for himself. We parked by the creek bed and crossed through the brush under a sky so clear it looked like a cracked glass dome. The trailer stood dark against the stars, thin streaks of moonlight running along the metal. It was smaller than I'd imagined, quiet as a grave. We didn't go inside at first, just circled it. There were 3 lawn chairs out front, one tipped over, a child's toy truck half buried in sand. The air was strange, cooler near the trailer, like standing next to a fridge left open. When I brushed my hand against the wall, I felt a faint vibration, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Then faintly the porch light flickered. Kenny froze. The bulb stuttered once, twice, then glowed dimly orange, as if something behind the walls had tried to wake it up. We heard a faint creak, the sound of a floorboard shifting, though the trailer was still. I said we should go, but Kenny walked right up to the door, laughing under his breath, saying maybe the family had come back. He knocked once, then twice, and the door moved a little, like it had been caught on the latch. The smell hit us then, burnt ozone, sharp and sour. Inside was colder. My breath fogged a little, which made no sense for August. The living space was small, clean, but abandoned. Plates on the counter, folded blankets, a small TV that had melted slightly along the edge like it had overheated. The hum was louder now, pulsing softly through the floor. It wasn't coming from any one thing. It was in everything, in the air itself. There were 3 chairs at the table. On one, a cup of coffee sat half full, crusted over but still faintly warm when I touched it. I swear to you it was warm. Kenny went toward the back, calling out, "Hello? Anybody home?" His voice sounded swallowed, muffled, like the air didn't want to carry it. He pulled back a curtain that separated the living space from the back room and stopped. I couldn't see what he was looking at, only the light from his flashlight shaking slightly. He didn't answer me. When I came closer, I saw why. The back room was lined with something that wasn't right. Not photos, not wallpaper. It looked like paper glued to the walls, each sheet covered in rows of numbers and tiny marks drawn by hand. Hundreds of them, all in black pen, dates maybe, or coordinates. The handwriting was neat, small, almost mechanical. The ceiling, too, covered edge to edge in ink. And in the center of the floor, pressed into the linoleum, was a blackened ring, burned perfectly circular. Kenny knelt beside it and said quietly, "They stood here." He pointed to 4 distinct shapes, faint outlines in the soot, like where feet had been. 3 small, 1 taller, like a family standing together. In the center of the ring was something else, a small metal object half melted, fused to the floor. It looked like a key. The hum grew louder, sharp enough to make my teeth ache. The light bulb overhead flickered, and every number on the wall seemed to shimmer at once. Then, without warning, the light went completely white. For a split second, everything disappeared into that brightness, and I felt a deep pull in my chest, like something was trying to drag me forward, into the center of the room. Kenny grabbed my arm and yanked me back through the curtain, slamming into the table. The coffee cup fell and shattered, and just like that, the light died. We stumbled outside into the night. The air was dead still, no wind, no sound. The desert felt wrong, too quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. I looked back once before we got to the truck, and the trailer's windows were glowing faintly again, a dull orange light seeping from the seams. We didn't talk the whole drive back. Kenny moved out of Presidio 2 days later. Said he couldn't sleep right, said the hum wouldn't leave his ears. I didn't see him again after that summer. A month later, I drove past that road again. The trailer was gone. Not towed, not dismantled, gone. The patch of dirt where it had stood was smooth and empty, as if it had never been there at all. The mailbox was still there, though, leaning slightly, with the Darnells written in faded black. When I stopped to look, I noticed something else. Sticking out of the sand beneath it was a metal object, half buried, catching the sun. It was the same shape as the key from that room, I left it there. Now some nights if you drive that stretch west of town with your windows down, you'll hear a faint hum under the wind. Just a low, steady vibration that comes and goes like breath. And sometimes on clear nights when the stars are sharp enough to cut glass, a single orange light flickers out on the flats for a few minutes, then fades back into the dark. No one lives out there anymore, but the ground hums all the same. In the small town of Palestine, Texas, there's a bakery on Main Street that still smells of yeast and sugar long after closing. It's been there since the 60s. A squat brick building with sun-faded signage and an old bell that jingles whenever someone pushes through the front door. For as long as anyone can remember, there's been a handprint on the front window. Not a big one either. Small, like it belonged to a child pressed against the glass just beside the open sign. Every morning it's wiped clean and by dusk without fail it reappears. Martha, the owner, had run that bakery for nearly 25 years. She'd seen that handprint every single day of her working life, and though the town had its stories, she'd always dismissed them. Palestine was full of old talk. Haunted sawmills, dead trains that still whistled, lights in the pine forests. People liked to make sense of what scared them, she'd say. And what didn't make sense, they'd fill in with ghosts. But deep down, she couldn't deny that the handprint never failed to return, even when she replaced the whole pane of glass 3 summers back. It was there the next morning. Same height, same small fingers, same faint outline of a palm pressed against the world from the other side. She told herself it was kids, someone's brat sneaking up at night playing tricks. So she installed a little camera inside, angled toward the street. The first night she watched from her living room after closing. Nothing but stillness. Cars passing occasionally, a dog trotting by, the reflection of streetlights flickering across the window. Then around 2:30 in the morning, the motion sensor light blinked on. The street was empty. Her heart beat hard in her chest as she stared at the feed. The light burned for 5 seconds, 10. Then something pale moved across the glass, so faint it might have been a trick of glare. And when she rewound the footage, the handprint was just there. No child, no sound, no shadow, just there. She didn't tell anyone at first, but by the next evening she started to feel uneasy inside the shop. The bakery had always been her haven, the hum of the ovens, the warmth, the smell of dough rising, but now it felt like someone was watching her. She'd hear little taps at the window when she was kneading the bread, the kind of soft, rhythmic drumming a child might make when bored. When she looked up, nothing. Once she thought she saw a smudge of fog spread briefly across the glass, shaped almost like a face, but gone before she could blink twice. The old man across the street, Carl, was the first to bring it up. He ran the hardware store and had lived in Palestine longer than most. He came by one morning and said quietly, "You know, that window's been like that since before you were born." He told her about a boy from the neighborhood back in 1968 who used to help his mama at the bakery that stood on that very lot. The kid was 6 or 7, always running around barefoot, always pressing his sticky hands against the window when he wanted to come in. One night there'd been a fire, faulty wiring. His mama made it out. He didn't. They rebuilt the place a year later, new owners, new sign. But when the first morning sun hit the new window, that little handprint was already there. Martha tried to laugh it off, but when she got home that night, she couldn't shake the thought. She dreamed of the bakery burning, the smell of smoke and dough turning to ash. In the dream, a child's hand reached out from the fire and pressed against invisible glass, leaving a perfect print as the skin blackened. She woke drenched in sweat and went to wash her face. But when she looked in the mirror, there was a faint, dusty handprint on the glass, not hers. The next morning, she drove straight to church. She wasn't particularly religious, but something about it felt necessary. She told the pastor about what she'd seen. He listened quietly, then asked if she'd ever tried blessing the place. He came by that afternoon carrying a small vial of holy water and a worn Bible. They walked the shop together, him murmuring prayers, sprinkling the corners. When they reached the front window, the handprint was there, faint but distinct. He stared at it for a long moment, then whispered a final prayer and crossed himself. "If it's a soul still reaching," he said softly, "it may not want to be forgotten." For a few days, the print didn't reappear. Martha felt lighter, as if the air itself had cleared. But by the following Friday, she noticed something different. When she opened the shop early that morning, she saw not one, but 2 handprints on the glass. Both small, both side by side, She tried to stay calm, told herself maybe she hadn't noticed the second one before, but that night she left the lights on inside, wanting to see if anything would happen. The streets were quiet after 10, the air thick with that East Texas humidity that sticks to your skin. Around midnight, she was sitting in the back watching the window through the open doorway. The reflection of the neon sign painted red across the glass, flickering every few seconds. Then she heard it, a soft tapping, just once, like fingers on glass. She froze. Another tap. Then the light over the counter flickered, humming like it was straining to stay alive. The air grew cold, sharp enough that she could see her breath. Slowly she rose and stepped toward the front, her shoes squeaking on the tile. The street outside was empty. The window stood there, shining faintly under the yellow streetlight. And then she saw them, tiny shapes blurred against the reflection, moving. Hands, not just one or two this time. A cluster of them, pressing from the inside out, leaving streaks of moisture across the glass as if something behind it were desperate to get through. She stumbled back, knocking into a chair, and the sound seemed to snap the lights back to life. When she looked again, the window was clean just as it had been. But her own reflection seemed distorted, like the glass had rippled. She could swear she saw something behind her, short, dark figures standing just inside the oven room. She turned around. Nothing. The next day she didn't open. Carl came by to check on her, knocking on the back door until she let him in. She was pale, shaking, her hands coated in flour, though she hadn't baked a thing. "It's not just one anymore," she whispered. "It's like they're all coming back." That night, the townsfolk said the bakery lights stayed on until nearly dawn. No one went in, but a few passing drivers swore they saw silhouettes moving behind the glass. Small ones, like children, flickering in and out as if made of smoke. When morning came, the lights were out, and the smell of burning bread hung heavy in the air. The fire department found Martha inside, unconscious but alive, though the ovens hadn't been turned on. They said she kept muttering something over and over, something about how she finally saw him. The bakery never reopened. Carl boarded up the windows and closed the shop himself. But every so often, someone walking by claims to hear the faint tapping from inside. The boards shift, and through the cracks under a slant of early evening light, you can still see it pressed against the glass. A child's handprint, perfectly clear, always reaching outward, and no matter how many times the rain washes over it, by nightfall it's there again, waiting. The Pine Country in Shelby County holds a kind of silence that feels wrong. It isn't peaceful or empty. It's expectant, like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to move. I found the church without a cross one August afternoon, when the air was thick enough to taste. The road that led there wasn't on any map I'd seen, a sandy cut through the pines that started off paved but broke into gravel and then dirt, narrowing until the branches began to scrape the sides of my truck like fingernails. I was looking for old cemeteries for a photography project, but when I saw the clearing up ahead, I stopped. The church stood alone, small and sun-bleached, its paint the gray of old bones. There was no cross on the steeple, no sign, not even a name carved into the wooden door. Just that single bare building surrounded by a few leaning stones half swallowed by weeds. The roof sagged in the middle like it had been carrying a burden for too long. I got out, and the air immediately felt different, heavier, stiller. The only sound was the faint hiss of cicadas. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards gave a slow groan, and I remember thinking it sounded almost human, like something complaining quietly under its breath. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open without a sound. Inside, it smelled of dust and rot, that sweet, heavy scent of wood gone soft with time. Pews sat in uneven rows, and sunlight came through broken windows in sharp white beams that revealed 1,000 floating particles. But what I remember most was the emptiness. No altar, no cross, no hymnals, no Bible. Just bare space and dust. I tried to take a few photos, but my camera froze. It turned on fine, but the screen stayed black. I took the battery out, wiped it, tried again, nothing. I told myself it was the heat or the humidity, but when I stepped back outside, the camera worked perfectly. That was enough for me to get one quick shot of the building before I left. That night back in center, I checked the photo. The church was there, but so was something else, something faint. In the doorway, half in shadow, stood a figure. It wasn't solid, more like a smudge of gray against the darker wood, a trick of the light, I thought. But the next day I went back. I told myself it was curiosity, but it was more than that. Something about that place had its hooks in me. The road looked different this time. I could have sworn there were turns where there hadn't been before. The trees leaned closer and I had to slow to a crawl just to make it through. When I reached the clearing, the air felt colder, the way it does before a storm, though the sky was clear. I left the truck running. The church door was open, swinging slightly. Inside, everything looked the same except for the floor near the front. Someone or something had drawn a rough circle in the dust. Inside it, a series of marks like symbols or letters, but not in any language I knew. I stepped closer, feeling my chest tighten. The air felt charged, the way it does near a downed power line. Then, from somewhere near the back, I heard whispering. It wasn't clear speech. More like 100 overlapping breaths, all trying to form words and failing. I froze, my pulse hammering. The sound came in waves, rising and falling, as if the building itself was breathing. I backed toward the door, and that's when I noticed the smell. Wet earth and something metallic, sharp like blood. I didn't look back. I got in the truck, threw it in reverse, and didn't stop until I saw the highway again. But the whispering followed me, faint at first, then growing louder until I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the back seat. I swerved hard, nearly clipping a pine, and when I turned, the seat was empty. I kept driving. For 2 nights, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whispering. I started seeing flashes of pine needles and that empty doorway whenever I blinked. The 3rd night, I drove back out there, telling myself I'd end it, whatever it was. The moon was full when I reached the clearing. The church looked smaller somehow, hunched in on itself. My headlights cut across the windows and I saw movement inside. I killed the engine and got out. The night was dead silent, no wind, no insects, nothing. I walked up the steps, heart pounding. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispering began again, louder now, as if it had been waiting for me. This time I understood a word. Stay. It came from everywhere at once, echoing through the rafters and crawling under my skin. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Not shut, gone. The wall was seamless. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pew, and landed hard. Dust rose in clouds around me. When it settled, I saw them. Shapes moving in the corners, darker than the shadows. They weren't people, not exactly. They had outlines, faces that flickered in and out of focus, eyes that glowed like wet stone catching the moonlight. One stepped forward, mouth moving in a slow, unnatural way like someone trying to remember how to speak. No cross, it whispered. No light. The others echoed it in a rising chorus, filling the church until the sound felt like it was pressing against my skull. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside me now. I ran toward where the door had been, hit the wall, and fell again. My vision blurred, and I thought I saw something painted across the far wall. Faint outlines of crosses, dozens of them, all upside down, carved deep into the wood. I must have blacked out. When I woke, the church was empty. The door was back. Morning light came through the cracks in the roof. I stumbled outside, dizzy, throat dry, and realized the truck was gone. Just gone. No tracks, no sound of an engine anywhere. I walked for what felt like hours before I reached a road. A farmer picked me up, asked where I'd come from. I told him the old church off the dirt road, and his face changed. He said there wasn't any church out that way. Not for 50 years. Burned down, he said. Lightning strike in 71, I didn't argue. He dropped me at a gas station, and I stayed there until someone from town gave me a ride back to center. When I developed the film from that week, the last photo, the one of the church, was gone. In its place was a gray blur and faint in the center. A shape that looked like a circle drawn in ash, with something scratched inside it that looked like letters. I moved out of Shelby County a few months later, but sometimes late at night I still hear that whispering. It comes from the corners of the room, rising just above the hum of the air conditioner. Always the same word, stay. Highway 170 out near Terlingua feels like the edge of the world. It winds through scrub and stone, through the jagged bones of desert hills, and it always seems to be going nowhere. People call it the River Road, but that's misleading. Most of the time you don't even see the Rio Grande, just empty sky and land that looks half burned by the sun. I was one of those tourists once, chasing the ghost of an old mining town because I'd seen some photos online of crumbling buildings and a saloon still standing against the wind. The idea of walking through the remains of a place that had been alive a century ago fascinated me. But the road to Terlingua did something to me I can't explain, and even now I'm not sure it was ever just a road. It was late afternoon when I left Study Butte, heading west. The sky was cloudless, and the air shimmered in that strange way it does when the heat turns real things into mirages. The pavement stretched ahead in faded gray ribbons, with patches where the asphalt had crumbled down to pale gravel. I had a rental car, one of those compact white sedans that hum like a wasp when you push them over 60. My GPS kept dropping out, switching between coordinates like it couldn't decide where I was. I remember laughing at that, telling myself it was just the bad signal. Out here, you lose signal all the time. By the time I saw the first sign for Terlingua Ghost Town, the sun was lowering behind the mountains. I turned off onto a smaller road that climbed a low hill. On one side were scattered mesquite and the occasional cactus, and on the other side the land just seemed to fall away, a stretch of open desert that went on forever. I saw the town in the distance, old stone ruins, a few shacks still standing, and a church with no roof. The place looked like a painting someone had left out in the weather too long. I stopped near what must have been the old trading post and got out to walk around. There was no one else there, at least not that I could see. Just the sound of wind pushing through broken windows and a metal sign creaking on rusted hinges. A part of me liked that, the silence, the emptiness, but there was also a feeling I couldn't shake. Something about the air itself, like it had weight. After a few minutes, I started hearing what I thought was a low hum, the kind of deep vibration you get when a truck passes by far off. Only it didn't fade. It seemed to stay right on the edge of hearing, steady and dull, like the ground itself was alive with it. I figured I'd had enough sightseeing for one evening, so I got back in the car. I looked at the road behind me, the same narrow strip I'd come in on, curving back toward the main highway. But when I started driving, something didn't line up. I drove for maybe 5 minutes and then checked my rearview mirror. The town was gone. I looked left and right, expecting to see the hills that had been there before, but the landscape didn't match. The desert was flatter now, more barren. I told myself I must have taken the wrong road out, but there hadn't been any turnoffs. Just one way in and one way out. The humming grew stronger, not louder, but more physical, like it was coming from under my seat. I stopped the car, turned off the engine, and the sound stopped too. For a moment, everything was dead quiet. Then the wind came back, sweeping sand across the hood. I got out, trying to orient myself, but the road behind me was no longer visible. It was just open desert, the kind of cracked earth that runs between patches of sage and rock. I turned around, expecting to see the road ahead at least, but it too seemed to fade into the sand. My car was sitting in the middle of nothing. I started to panic. I kept thinking about how easy it would be to get lost out here. How many tourists die every year trying to hike the desert without water. But I wasn't hiking. I was in my car. I'd been on pavement minutes ago. I pulled my phone out again, hoping for GPS, but the screen was black. Not dead, just black. I held the power button until my thumb hurt, but it wouldn't turn on. I got back into the car and just sat there, breathing too fast. The humming came again, faint at first, then pulsing stronger, syncing with my heartbeat. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something move behind me. Not close, just a shimmer, like heat distortion. It rippled once and then froze, taking on a shape. It looked like headlights, two bright points of light, steady and white. Relief hit me at first. Someone else was out here. Maybe they knew the way. I turned around fully, but there was nothing there. The lights existed only in the mirror. They stayed the same distance away, no matter how long I watched. I started the car and put it in drive. The hum rose with the engine, merging into one sound. I drove straight toward where the road should have been, and I swear the desert shifted. The sand rippled like water, and the car sank an inch lower. I hit the brakes, and everything went still again. I checked the mirror. The lights were still there, still the same distance back. I started shouting, pounding the steering wheel. I didn't know who I was yelling at, the lights or myself. I tried reversing toward them, but the car wouldn't move. The tires spun in loose dust, and the engine sputtered as if choking on the air. That was when I saw the figure. It was standing beside the car on the passenger side. A man maybe, though it was hard to tell because his skin had that pale color the desert gives to sun-bleached bone. He wore something old, torn fabric that might once have been a shirt, and his mouth was moving though no sound came out. I froze, staring straight ahead, pretending I didn't see him. The figure leaned closer until his reflection filled the mirror. His eyes were hollow, sunken pits that caught no light. The humming grew louder, deep enough to shake the mirror. I turned my head slowly, but there was no one outside the window. When I looked back, the reflection was still there, smiling now. I don't know how long I sat like that, trapped between moving and not moving. Eventually, the lights behind me began to fade, sinking into the dark horizon, and the reflection disappeared with them. When I came to, the car was on the shoulder of the highway near Study Butte, engine idling. The fuel gauge was almost empty, though I couldn't remember driving that far. The phone was working again, GPS showing my location like nothing had happened. But when I tried to retrace the route later, there was no turnoff, no smaller road leading to Terlingua Ghost Town. Locals told me the road hasn't existed for years, that it was washed out by floods long before I ever came. Still, sometimes at night, if you drive west of Study Butte and glance in your mirror, you'll see the faint shine of headlights behind you, always the same distance away. Some say it's the miners who died out there a century ago, still trying to find their way home. But others think it's the desert itself, swallowing up anyone foolish enough to follow a road that never really existed. A road that vanishes the moment you try to leave. In 1924, Cisco was a small, dusty Texas town with a sheriff's office that smelled of sweat, tobacco, and old iron. The jail sat behind the courthouse, a squat limestone building that held the town's worst secrets. Of all its cells, one was different, smaller than the rest, darker and colder. That was cell 3, and that's where they locked up Tom Hasker, the man who slit the preacher's throat behind the First Baptist Church one summer evening. Tom swore he didn't do it. He said the preacher wasn't even human by the end, that his eyes had gone black and he whispered in a language no man should hear. Folks figured he'd gone mad. They dragged him out of his shack and threw him into cell 3 while the trial was being arranged. But he never made it that far. 3 nights later, he hung himself with his own belt from the iron bar above the cot. The sheriff found him swinging slow in the lantern light, his eyes wide open, his tongue black and stiff. That was the night the door started closing by itself. At first, they thought it was the wind. Cisco had plenty of it. Hard, dry gusts that pushed dust through the cracks and rattled the shutters. But this was different. The sheriff, Henry Dobson, had left the door open that night, and when he came back from the front desk, the heavy iron door was shut tight. The lock slid into place. He cursed and yanked it open again. The next morning, it was shut again. After the 3rd time, he chained it open, threading a length of steel through the latch and around the bars. But the next night, the sound came again. It was loud enough to wake the whole office, a metallic slam that shook the walls. The chain lay snapped in half, the door sealed. They left it alone after that. Years passed. New sheriffs came and went. They moved the jail to a bigger building closer to the highway in the 1950s, leaving the old limestone structure behind as a records room. No one wanted cell 3, but they kept it because no one wanted to dig it out either. They tried welding it shut once, but the welds broke after a month. The next sheriff just nailed the door and said a prayer. By the time I came to Cisco in 1998, the story was local legend. I'd been working as a crime reporter for a small paper in Abilene and had heard about the cell that slammed shut from an old deputy over coffee. I didn't believe in hauntings, but I believed in good stories, and the way he talked about it, voice low, hand trembling on the cup, told me it wasn't something made up for tourists. He said he'd heard it himself when he was a rookie in '59, that the sound echoed all through the jail like a gunshot in a tunnel. The building still stood then, empty but locked, with a faded county seal painted over the doorway. I got permission from the town office to take photos for a local history column. They handed me the key and said I could go in until sunset. Inside, it smelled like rust and dry paper. The floorboards creaked, and dust hung in the slanted light from the windows. You could feel the age of it, the heaviness that comes from a place that's seen too much grief. The cells were lined up in the back, iron bars corroded, the numbers stenciled faintly above each door. 1, 2, 3. I almost didn't notice that the 3rd door was slightly ajar, a gap of about 2 inches. The hinges groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing but a cot frame and a wall scarred with old graffiti. Initials, tally marks, a few words too faint to read. The air felt colder than the hallway, though the afternoon sun hit the window directly. I remember shivering even though it was July. I set my camera bag down and started taking pictures. Wide shots first, then close-ups. My flash flickered against the iron, and every time it went off, the shadows seemed to crawl across the wall differently, like they were trying to get out of the frame. When I was almost done, I heard the faintest sound, a single metallic creak behind me. The door. It was moving, inch by inch, closing without a breeze. I froze, heart pounding, watching it inch toward the frame. My rational mind screamed it was gravity. Bad hinges, anything but what it looked like. But then it picked up speed, swinging shut fast enough to stir the dust in the air. I lunged for it, but before I reached it, it slammed. The noise was deafening in that small space. I yanked at the handle. It didn't budge. I shouted, kicked, pulled, nothing. It was locked tight, even though I could see the latch hadn't moved into place. My chest started to tighten. I was trapped in the same cell where Tom Hasker had hung himself 74 years ago. Minutes crawled by. I told myself someone would come, that the clerk at the office would notice I hadn't returned the key. But as the sun went down, the light in the room dimmed to a dirty orange, then to gray. I heard something faint then, a dragging sound above me. The ceiling beam. I looked up and saw a dark mark on the wood, shaped like a noose had rubbed against it again and again. Then came another sound, something brushing the wall behind the cot. I turned, and for a moment I swear I saw a man standing in the corner. Not solid, but darker than the rest of the room, as if the shadows themselves had gathered into his outline. His head tilted, and I saw the shape of a belt around his neck. I pressed my back to the bars, too terrified to move. He didn't speak, but I heard something, not out loud, but inside my head, a low voice saying, "It wasn't me." Then came the slam again, but this time from the inside. The air rushed out of the room as if something invisible had moved past me, and suddenly the door flew open by itself. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping, clutching my camera like a weapon. The building was silent. When I looked back, the door was wide open. I backed away until I was outside in the sun again. The pictures developed fine, except for one. The last frame, the one I took of the inside wall before the door moved, showed something behind me. A figure hanging from the ceiling, blurred and translucent, its face twisted in agony. The sheriff's department confiscated that photo when I tried to publish it, saying it was disrespectful to the families involved. A year later, the county finally tore down the old jail. They bulldozed the whole block to make way for a new parking lot beside the courthouse. But people still hear it. Deputies say that when they're locking up at night, they sometimes hear the faint sound of a door slamming in the distance, metallic, echoing, final. And no matter how many times they check, there's nothing left there but the wind. Except once, a new deputy found something strange while doing a patrol near the lot. He said he saw a heavy chain lying in the dirt, broken clean in half, the ends rusted as if they'd been snapped a long time ago. He didn't stay on the job long after that. The wind around Lake Meredith always carried a kind of quiet that pressed into your ears like cotton. Even on warm evenings when the waves lapped lazily against the docks and crickets chirped along the brushy banks, there was something heavy in that silence, as if the water itself were listening. I first went there in late spring, back in 2014, when the rains had filled the lake higher than it had been in years. The shoreline swallowed old trails and half the piers. Locals said the lake was haunted, that sometimes at night you could see lights drifting across the water, slow and human-shaped, glowing a pale blue before vanishing without a sound. I thought it was just campfire talk, stories made to make beer taste better and darkness feel thicker, but I learned quick how wrong that was. My friend Keith and I used to fish off the North Bank near Harbor Bay. He worked at a machine shop in Borger. I was a night clerk at a motel outside Amarillo, and we'd drive up every other weekend to fish until dawn. It wasn't for the catch so much as for the peace of it. We'd sit out there with the lantern between us, the air smelling of mud and rain, listening to the hum of cicadas and the slosh of catfish in the shallows. That first night in June, Keith brought a small cooler, and by midnight we'd emptied half of it. The moon was thin, just a smudge behind the clouds. Around 1, the air turned strange, still and thick like something waiting to break. I remember Keith suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his cigarette glowing at his lip, and pointed out over the water. "You see that?" he said. I turned and saw it too. About 50 yards from shore, a faint bluish shimmer hung above the water, the size and shape of a person. The glow was steady, not like a reflection or a headlamp, and it moved with a slow, deliberate pace across the surface, footsteps sending no ripple at all. We sat frozen, staring. Then another one appeared behind it, then a third, 3 figures walking side by side, silent and glowing, drifting toward the middle of the lake. My first thought was that it had to be some trick of light, maybe someone night fishing with bright gear, but they were too defined. I could see the faint curve of shoulders, the tilt of heads. Keith whispered that his uncle used to talk about them. That they came when the wind died, always in threes, and if you called out to them, they'd turn and vanish. I didn't believe him, but I didn't speak either. We just watched until the last faint glimmer sank beneath the waves and was gone. The next morning, we asked around at the bait shop near Sanford. The old man there, Curtis, just shook his head, said the lights had been seen since the 60s, back when the town of Fritch had flooded parts of the canyon to make the reservoir. They say there were homesteads down there, he told us. Whole houses, barns, even a church. When the water's low, you can still see the rooftops poking up. They walk when the water's high, though. Maybe looking for what they lost? He smiled when he said it, but his eyes didn't. Keith and I laughed it off. But that image stayed with me. Houses rotting beneath the water, windows staring up through the silt. We kept fishing there all summer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake didn't want us there after dark. There were times when the fog rolled in too fast, when the lantern light dimmed for no reason, and once, when Keith was out in his little aluminum boat, he swore something brushed against the hull hard enough to rock it. When he looked over the edge, he said he saw a pale handprint sliding off the metal into the black water. I didn't believe that part, but I noticed after that he started drinking earlier each trip, and he never took the boat out again. In August, we camped overnight at an old site near Plum Creek. There was no moon, just a wide black sky and the faint orange flicker of our fire. Sometime past 2, I woke up to what sounded like whispering, not loud but close, like voices moving across the water. I got out of the tent and saw the lake shining faintly with that same soft blue light, spreading in thin lines that pulsed like veins. Out toward the center, 3 glowing shapes stood still, their reflections stretching like spider legs across the surface. One of them turned, or maybe I only imagined it, but it felt like it was facing me. The air dropped cold and my breath came out in white fog even though it was a warm night. I backed up until I stumbled into the tent, shaking Keith awake. When we looked again, the lake was dark. No light, no movement, only the sound of small waves tapping the shore. The next morning we found something strange. Near the waterline, right where our footprints ended, there were others. Barefoot, narrow and deep, as if pressed by someone stepping out of the water. They led up about 10 feet, then stopped. No drag marks, no return prints. Keith took pictures, but later said his phone corrupted them. Every image was just black static with faint blue streaks. By September, Keith stopped coming altogether. His sister told me he'd started having nightmares, said he kept seeing the lake people in mirrors and windows. He quit his job, sold his boat, and moved to Lubbock. I went out there one last time by myself just before winter. The water was lower and some of the lake bed had started to show near the coves. You could see old fence posts sticking out of the mud, bits of foundation stones. I walked along the edge until I found a rusted sign half buried that read, Henderson Ranch, Esther, 1911. I was standing over what had once been someone's home, now resting beneath years of silt. I don't know what made me do it, but I said aloud, I hope you're at peace down there. As soon as I did, the air shifted again, still, heavy, listening. Then came a splash out near the center, followed by another closer rhythmic like footsteps. The water glowed faintly blue again, the light creeping toward shore. I ran. A few weeks later, I heard Keith had been found drowned in a reservoir outside Lubbock. His car was parked at the edge, door still open, no sign of a struggle. The police said he'd probably slipped. I never believed that. When I drove by Lake Meredith again the next spring, I didn't stop. Even from the road, I thought I saw faint lights drifting over the surface, slow and silent. I rolled up my window and kept going, but I could feel them watching as I passed. Some nights when it rains heavy and the air gets that same still thickness, I dream of standing by the shore again, the lake black and endless, and see them walking toward me. Their faces are pale and blank, their bodies outlined in that strange blue shimmer, and beneath their feet the water stays perfectly calm. No ripples, no sound at all. I always wake before they reach me, heart hammering, throat dry. But I know if I ever go back, if I stand there long enough, I'll see them again, and this time they won't disappear. In the small Texas town of Bowie, people paid attention to each other's routines. It wasn't gossip, not exactly, just the kind of neighborly awareness that comes from living in a place where the same faces fill the pews every Sunday and wave from the same porches every evening. The Wilcox family were part of that rhythm. Martin and Denise, both in their 40s, were the kind of couple who volunteered for the church picnic every year. Their kids, Lily and Thomas, were polite, the kind of children who said yes, sir, and no, ma'am. They lived in a white two-story house on the edge of town, the kind that always looked freshly painted, with a flag fluttering from the porch and a wind chime that sang every time the breeze rolled in from the north. They were at church that Sunday like always. Martin helped fold chairs after service, Denise brought lemon bars to the potluck, and Lily played the piano while Thomas handed out hymnals. Nothing strange, nothing that hinted at what would happen later. But by Monday morning their house was silent. It was Mrs. Gaines, the neighbor across the road, who noticed first. She saw the curtains still drawn at 9 in the morning, which was odd because Denise usually opened them early. Around 10, she saw the mailman slip an envelope into their box, and it stayed there. By afternoon, she walked over and knocked. No answer. She tried calling Denise's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When Martin didn't show up to work at the hardware store that day, his boss called the sheriff. When Deputy Coulson arrived, the house was locked tight. He tried the front door, then the back, then peered through the kitchen window and saw something that made his stomach twist. The table was set for breakfast. 4 plates, scrambled eggs half-eaten, a pitcher of orange juice sweating onto the tablecloth. One of the chairs was tipped just slightly, like someone had stood up in a hurry. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and the only sound came from the ceiling fan turning lazily above. They forced the door open. Inside, it was cooler than it should have been, the air thick with the faint smell of cooked food and something metallic, like rust or wet iron. Nothing was disturbed, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no missing valuables. The car sat in the driveway, keys on the counter, and Martin's wallet was in his jeans pocket draped over a chair. Upstairs, the beds were made, the rooms tidy, but there were little things that felt wrong. Lily's shoes were on the floor beside her bed, the left one tipped on its side. Her backpack sat open, homework half finished. The window was locked, but the curtain was pulled aside as if she'd been looking out. Thomas's baseball glove was on his desk, a ball still resting inside. Denise's hairbrush was on the vanity, strands of her blonde hair caught in the bristles. The house wasn't empty in the way that comes from moving out. It was frozen mid-moment, like everyone had just stepped away and never came back. Forensics came from Fort Worth. They dusted for prints, checked for signs of forced entry, ran cadaver dogs through the woods behind the property. Nothing. No blood, no tracks, no signs of anyone leaving on foot. The doors had been locked from the inside, even the deadbolt on the back door. It made no sense. The next Sunday, Pastor Holbrook led a prayer service for the family. Half the town showed up. People whispered theories, carbon monoxide, a family pact, kidnappers, but the sheriff said none of it fit. Weeks turned into months, and the Wilcox house just sat there quiet and waiting. The church organized volunteers to keep the yard from going wild, but after a while even that stopped. Grass grew high, mail piled up, and a for sale sign went in the yard, though no one ever came to look. That might have been the end of it, another small-town mystery swallowed by time, if not for what happened that October. A new deputy named Harris was making rounds when he saw a light on in the Wilcox house. It was nearly midnight. The place had no power. The utilities had been shut off months earlier, so the faint yellow glow in the kitchen window didn't make sense. He radioed it in and approached, thinking maybe kids had broken in. But as he stepped onto the porch, he heard something that made him stop cold. It was the faint sound of silverware clinking on plates. He called out, no answer. He tried the handle, locked, same as before. When he circled to the back, he found the door slightly ajar. The air inside smelled faintly of something burnt. He stepped into the kitchen and froze. The table was set again. 4 plates, 4 glasses, and the same food, untouched but fresh, steam still curling from the eggs. He backed out slow, hand on his gun, and called for backup. When the others arrived minutes later, the lights were gone. The food was cold. The plates were empty, but one of the chairs was pulled far from the table now, almost toppled over. And on the wall above the kitchen light switch, written in something that looked like ash or soot, was a single word, stay. After that, people started avoiding the road entirely. Some said they saw figures through the windows at night, just silhouettes standing behind the curtains. Others swore they heard the faint sound of piano music coming from inside, a child's voice humming a hymn. The sheriff finally ordered the house boarded up. But even through the plywood, neighbors said they saw light flicker sometimes, soft and yellow like lamplight. A year later, the property was auctioned off to a man from Dallas named Keene, who wanted to restore it. He didn't believe the stories. He said small towns like Bowie always had a ghost tale or two. He brought in contractors, cleaned up the yard, started repainting. The first few days went fine. Then one morning the crew didn't show up. Keene drove over and found their tools scattered in the grass. The house was locked, his truck still in the drive. He went around back and noticed something strange through the kitchen window. The table was set again. 4 plates. When police arrived that afternoon, they found no one inside. Keene was gone. The food was half-eaten, and the smell of burnt air was thicker than before. They locked it up again. No one talks about the Wilcox family anymore, not really. But the locals know better than to drive past that stretch of road after dark. They say if you stop and listen, you can hear the wind chime on the porch still ringing, even when the air is dead still. And if you look toward the window, sometimes you'll see the faint outline of 4 people sitting at the table, heads bowed like they're praying. But if you linger too long, the curtain moves, and someone looks back. In Mason, the air feels different once you leave the main road. The town sits quiet under the heavy arms of oak trees, the kind that creak in the wind even when the night is still. People hear wave from their porches, but they don't talk much about the place on Old Brady Road, the one everyone calls the Silent House. It's been there longer than anyone remembers, a squat limestone home with boarded-up windows and ivy strangling its chimney. The realtor, a woman with a forced smile and a nervous habit of wringing her hands, told me I could rent it for $600 a month. In Mason, that's practically free. She said it had character, but her eyes darted away when I asked if there'd been any problems with tenants. She only said, "Most don't stay long." When I first pulled up, it didn't look so bad. The grass was tall but not wild. The porch sagged but held my weight. The front door opened with a sigh like it had been holding its breath. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and something older. Wood smoke maybe, or mold. The silence struck me first. Even when I moved around, unpacking my boxes and setting down furniture, there was no echo, no sound bouncing off the walls. Just a stillness that pressed against my ears until I caught myself whispering without meaning to. The first night was ordinary enough, aside from the feeling that someone was listening. When I went to bed, I left the window cracked open to let in some cool air. The cicadas were screaming in the trees, and somewhere down the road a dog barked once and went quiet. I slept badly, half awake most of the night, and sometime after 3 I heard a faint scratching in the walls. Mice, I thought, and rolled over. But it wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like something trying to trace a path through the plaster. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch. When I clapped my hands against the wall, the sound stopped. Then, from somewhere near the vent above my bed, a whisper came. I didn't catch any words, just the hush of breath pushing through metal. I told myself it was the wind and lay still until morning. By the second day, I was thinking I'd made a mistake. The silence wasn't normal. I tried filling the place with noise, radio, TV, my own voice, but everything came out muffled, like the house swallowed sound instead of reflecting it. Even the floors didn't creak when I walked. The realtor hadn't mentioned that. When I called her about the mice, she hesitated, then said, "It's just an old house, Mr. Tanner. Old houses make noises." But her tone suggested she'd heard it before. That night, the scratching came again, louder this time. I followed it from the bedroom to the hallway, pressing my ear to the wall. It moved when I moved, sliding along the inside of the plaster like something alive. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled off a vent cover, expecting to see nests or chewed wires. Nothing, just darkness. I shined the beam deeper and thought I saw movement. Thin fingers of dust swirling backward like the air itself was retreating from the light. Then came the whisper again, this time clearer, shaped like a word I didn't understand. It wasn't English, but it wasn't far from it either. A sound that felt too close, as if it were being spoken just behind my teeth. The next morning, I drove into town for supplies. The woman at the hardware store asked where I was living, and when I told her, her face changed. "You got the place on Old Brady?" she said. "Thought they tore that one down." When I told her it was still standing, she just nodded and wouldn't meet my eyes. Later at the diner, an old man in a trucker cap leaned over and said, "You renting that silent house?" When I asked why they called it that, he chuckled without humor. Because nothing in there talks back, not even sound. And when it does, you don't want to hear it. I stayed anyway. I don't know why. Maybe because the rent was cheap. Maybe because part of me wanted to prove it was just superstition. But by the end of the week, I wasn't sleeping at all. The scratching had become constant, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from under the floorboards. Once, when I bent down to listen, something tapped back from beneath the wood. 3 slow knocks. When I whispered, "Hello?" there was a breathless giggle through the vent. My blood went cold. I moved my mattress into the living room that night, but the sound followed. One evening, I tried recording it. I set up my phone near the vent and left it running. When I played it back, there was nothing for the first few minutes, then faint static like wind pushing through leaves. And then layered beneath it a voice, not whispering this time, but humming. A slow, tuneless hum that grew louder until I heard words forming between the notes. It was my name. Over and over in a voice that sounded like mine but wrong, drawn out, breathless, distorted like it came from deep underground. I threw the phone across the room and didn't touch it again. By the 9th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to sleep in my truck. But when I tried to leave, the front door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but the door stayed shut like something was holding it from the other side. I slammed my shoulder into it again and again until the frame shook. Then the whisper came back right against my ear this time, from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Stay." Just that one word. I froze, heart pounding, my breath clouding in the air though it wasn't cold. When I backed away, the door swung open on its own. Outside, the night was darker than I'd ever seen. The oaks around the yard looked taller, their branches twisted into shapes that blocked the moonlight. I drove into town and slept in the parking lot of a gas station until morning. When I went back the next day to grab my things, the house looked different. The windows I'd boarded were unsealed and the vent cover in the bedroom was gone. Inside, the silence was even heavier, pressing against me like water. I packed fast, not looking at the walls, but I couldn't ignore the faint sound following me through the rooms, the soft rhythm of footsteps that weren't mine. When I stepped outside, I locked the door behind me out of habit. As I walked toward my truck, I heard something slide across the inside floorboards. Then a single knock on the other side of the door. Not loud, just enough to say goodbye. I drove away without looking back, but halfway down Old Brady Road, my radio clicked on by itself. There was no station, just static. Then, beneath the static, the same humming I'd heard on the recording started again. I turned it off, but the sound didn't stop. It came from the air vents this time, quiet, patient, like it knew I could hear. I moved out of Mason 2 weeks later, but sometimes at night, when the house I live in now goes quiet, I still hear it. The soft scrape of fingernails behind the walls. The voice that sounds like mine, whispering through the vent, waiting for me to answer. On the flatlands east of Texarkana, where the soil turns red and the wind hums through the high grass, there's a stretch of abandoned rail that most folks have forgotten about. It cuts through private farmland, half swallowed by weeds and rust, leading nowhere. The tracks end in the middle of a field, as if whoever laid them simply stopped and walked away. Yet every autumn, when the nights turn cool and the air smells like rain and pine, people claim to hear a train out there, a single lonely whistle carried on the wind, echoing across the plains, fading into nothing. No lights, no smoke, just the sound and then silence. I used to think it was local folklore, one of those country tales that get passed around campfires and bars to keep kids from wandering too far after dark. But that was before I started working night shifts at the feed supply off Highway 82, before I started hearing it myself. The first time was in late October 2 years ago. It was close to midnight and the wind was still. I was loading sacks into the truck when the air changed like a pressure shift before a storm. Then came that whistle, long, mournful, far off but clear as day, the kind of sound that makes your skin tighten before your mind even knows why. I remember standing frozen beside the truck, looking out toward the fields beyond the rail line. The sound grew faint, then vanished altogether. I waited, half expecting to see a headlight cresting the trees, but the darkness stayed still. I told myself it was the Kansas City Southern line, maybe carrying freight through at a distance. But when I mentioned it to Dale, the old foreman, he gave me a look that told me not to push it. "Ain't no line running there no more," he said. "That track's been dead since the 50s. He was right. I checked. The spur line had been shut down after a derailment just outside Texarkana in 1954. A passenger car overturned in the floodplain, killing everyone inside. They said the soil was too unstable to rebuild, so they ripped up the rails on the east end and let the rest rot. But they never found the cause. No mechanical failure, no weather issue. The train had just accelerated past a curve that should have slowed it. No one could explain why. The next few nights I kept hearing it, always between 11 and 1. Always that same whistle, drifting from the east like a ghost's call. A few times I thought I could even hear the faint rumble of wheels, the metallic rhythm of weight on steel, fading as it neared the edge of hearing. Then nothing. One night I took the truck and drove out toward the sound, down the gravel road that wound through the farms. The moon was bright, the kind of light that makes even familiar things look strange. I parked near the old trestle bridge where the rusted track still crossed a dry creek. The whistle came again, closer now. I swear I felt the bridge tremble underfoot, as if something massive was passing over it. But when I shined my flashlight, the rails were empty, just grass swaying in the night breeze. That should have been enough for me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. The noise got under my skin. I started looking into the old wreck. County archives had little, just a yellowed clipping from the Gazette. The headline read, "Night train to Texarkana derails, 17 dead." Below it, a grainy photo of twisted steel and smoke. The article mentioned one passenger by name, Thomas H. Lovell, the conductor. Witnesses at the time said Lovell was seen running through the passenger car just before the crash, shouting for everyone to stay calm. They found his body near the engine, hand still gripping the brake lever. But it was pulled back, not down. The train had been accelerating when it left the track. I told myself maybe he had a heart attack or slipped. But then I found something else. A letter, preserved in the Texarkana Museum, written by Lovell's wife a few weeks after the crash. She claimed her husband had been hearing things before the accident. A phantom whistle late at night when he was off duty. Said he told her he dreamed of driving the train into the dark, unable to stop like something else had control. I stopped reading after that. Last fall I went back. I don't even know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe obsession. I brought a flashlight, a camera, and a thermos of coffee, parked at the same spot near the trestle. It was quiet at first, just the buzz of crickets and the far-off hum of a highway. Then, right on cue, the whistle came, louder than I'd ever heard it, close enough to feel the vibration in my chest. I lifted the camera, recording in the direction of the sound. That's when the wind rose, sudden and sharp, scattering the leaves like a burst of static. The air grew thick and metallic, and the rails beneath my feet began to hum. I saw light then, a dim golden glow curving around the bend, moving fast. I froze. It wasn't headlights, not exactly. It looked like a reflection, like fire caught in fog. The shape of a locomotive shimmered faintly, edges dissolving yet undeniably there. The whistle screamed again, splitting the night open. I jumped off the track just as the light surged past. The ground shuddered, dust lifted, my flashlight fell and rolled into the grass. I remember covering my head, waiting for impact that never came. When I finally looked up, the glow was gone. The tracks were empty again, not even a sound except for the creaking of metal cooling in the night air. When I checked the footage later, it was nothing but static and faint distortion. But in one frame, just one, you could see the rails glowing faintly and a figure standing where the engine would have been. A man in an old conductor's cap, face obscured, looking straight at the lens. A week later, I tried showing the footage to Dale. He watched it without saying a word, then shut the laptop. "You stay away from those tracks," he said. "That train's not meant for the living." When I pressed him, he told me his uncle had worked that line back in the day. Said after the crash, folks living nearby started hearing it every fall, always the same week the wreck happened, and sometimes when people went looking, they didn't come back. There's a story about a farmer who vanished in the 60s, last seen heading toward the rails after hearing the whistle. Another about 2 college kids in the 90s out ghost hunting. Their truck was found still idling by the trestle, doors open, no sign of them. The locals just stopped talking about it after a while. Easier that way. This past year, when the season turned again, I swore I'd ignore it. I stopped working nights, moved into town, tried to forget. But last week, on my porch in Texarkana, I heard it again. Faint but unmistakable, the same long, low wail rising from the east. My hands went cold. The sound grew louder, and for a second I thought I saw a glimmer of light beyond the tree line, like a lantern swaying in fog. I don't remember standing up, but I must have. I followed the sound down the dirt road behind my place, through the brush until I reached the old service path that led toward the abandoned rail bed. The whistle called again, closer now, and I swear the earth vibrated under my boots. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of burning oil. When I reached the tracks, they were shining faintly, as if freshly polished. I looked down the line, and there it was again. That shimmering glow curving through the dark, slow this time, almost graceful. It came to a stop 20 yards away. The outline of the train was clearer now, ghost-like but whole. Through the haze, I saw faces at the windows, pale and expressionless, staring out into nothing. The door at the front opened with a hiss of steam, though the air was cold and dry. And on the platform stood the conductor. Same cap, same silhouette. He lifted one hand and gestured toward me. Not a wave, more like an invitation. I don't know what made me move closer. Maybe it was the sound, that deep droning pull that seemed to come from inside my own head. My heart was pounding, but my feet kept moving. I was just a few steps from the platform when I noticed something. The rails beneath me were gone. The ground was bare dirt, no track, no ties, just a faint indentation where they should have been. The light flickered and the train began to fade piece by piece until it was gone. The whistle echoed once more, distant now, fading into the night. When I looked down again, I was standing alone in the middle of a field. No tracks, no sign of steel or wood, not even the old bridge in sight. Just weeds brushing my knees and the soft hum of crickets. I stumbled back toward the road, shaking so hard I could barely hold my flashlight. That was 3 nights ago. Since then, I've started hearing it again every evening around the same time. The whistle faint at first, then closer. Sometimes I think I can feel the floorboards vibrate under me when it passes. I keep the lights on, but that doesn't help much. Last night I woke to a sound outside, metal on gravel, slow and steady. I looked out the window, and in the faint reflection of my glass I could see something moving down the street. A glow, dim and yellow, drifting just above the ground, and beneath it, 2 long parallel lines of light stretching toward my door. The whistle blew once long and low, then silence. The locals around Beeville will tell you there are 2 kinds of nights in B County. The quiet kind, when the wind just rolls over the fields and the only sounds are the crickets and the low hum of trucks passing on Highway 181. And then there are the other nights, the ones when the wind dies out completely and the fields go so still that you can hear your own heartbeat. That's when people say the stranger walks Farm Road 666 again. I used to think it was just one of those campfire stories, something the old ranch hands made up to spook the kids. But I started running night deliveries for a feed supplier a few years back, and after a while you learn that B County has places where the dark feels heavier than it should. That road, especially the stretch between Pettis and Mineral, feels like it's holding its breath. There's no cell service for 10 miles and the fence posts look like sentinels under the moonlight. The land feels old too, older than the farms, older than the county itself. The first time I saw him was in late October, about 2 in the morning. I'd just dropped a load of fertilizer at a ranch near Normanna and was heading home. The FM 666 sign flashed in my headlights, white letters against black steel. A mile or so in, the mist started rolling in off the fields. It wasn't thick, just enough to blur the line between road and grass. That's when I noticed the light ahead of me. At first I thought it was a cyclist or someone walking with a flashlight. The glow bobbed gently from side to side, yellowish and weak. I slowed down a bit, squinting through the windshield. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat that hung down past his knees. He held an old lantern, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the 1900s, with glass sides and a handle looped over his fingers. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Hey, you all right out here?" I called out. The figure didn't answer. The lantern swayed once, twice, then the light inside flickered and went out completely. I blinked, thinking maybe he'd just lowered it. But when I looked again, he was gone. Not walking off the shoulder, not crouching, just gone. I sat there for a full minute, the engine idling, feeling my throat go dry. Then I put it in drive and didn't stop until I hit the main highway again. The next morning, I mentioned it to a couple of guys at the feed store. They looked at each other and laughed, but not in a friendly way. One of them, an older man named Curtis, just said, "That road's got its own company, son. You best keep your windows up if you drive it again." When I asked him what he meant, he told me about a wreck from the 1940s. A farmhand named Russell Dent supposedly got stranded one night, walking home with a lantern after his truck broke down. A drunk driver hit him on a blind curve and kept going. They didn't find Russell's body for 2 days. Ever since then, folks claimed they'd see him walking that same stretch trying to get home. I told myself that was all it was, a ghost story tied to some real tragedy. But over the next few months, more people started mentioning it without me bringing it up. A trucker said he'd seen a man waving a lantern near the fence line, only for it to vanish when he slowed down. A local deputy claimed he'd followed what looked like a light moving through the mesquite grove and never found a thing. Even a group of high school kids swore they saw the same glow while driving back from a football game. I stayed off that road for almost a year, but one night I didn't have a choice. A delivery mix-up forced me to take the detour through FM 666 to drop a crate of parts to a rancher near Skidmore. It was around 11 p.m., clear sky, almost full moon. I told myself that I'd keep my eyes on the road, not look for anything, just get it done. About halfway through the route, my radio started hissing. Static at first, then the faint trace of something like a voice under it. It wasn't music or a station, more like someone talking through water. I reached over to shut it off, but before I could, my headlights caught movement up ahead, a glow faint and steady just above the ditch. My heart dropped. I slowed down, barely rolling now. The light bobbed once, then twice, and then I saw him. Same figure, same long coat. The lantern swung gently from his hand. I wanted to believe it was a reflection, or maybe someone with an old camping lamp, but the light was too warm, too deliberate. I stopped about 20 feet away. My hands were shaking. "Sir, you okay?" I asked through the open window. He didn't answer. He turned slightly, just enough for me to see the edge of his face in the light. It wasn't clear, like something half hidden by fog, but I could make out one eye glinting pale yellow. Then the flame inside the lantern flared bright for a split second and went out. Everything went black. My truck engine cut off, the headlights died, even the dashboard lights went dark. I sat there gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles hurt, staring into the pitch-black night. The air felt cold, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a second. I could hear the ticking of the cooling engine, the distant chirp of a single cricket, and under that, a sound I can't describe. It wasn't wind or footsteps, more like the rasp of breathing just outside the driver's door. I didn't look. I just turned the key again and again until the engine sputtered back to life. The lights came on all at once, and when they did, the road ahead was empty. No man, no lantern, just the yellow line stretching off into nothing. I floored it the rest of the way to the ranch. I didn't tell anyone about it for months. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a ghost with a lantern? That the darkness itself felt alive? But the thing about B County is you don't have to talk about it. Everyone already knows. 2 years later, I met a sheriff's deputy named Henson who'd worked the area for decades. We got to talking about weird calls, and I finally brought it up. He nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He told me they still get reports every few months. A man with a lantern walking near mile marker 7. Always the same description, same time of night. Henson said that one time, they even found a truck stopped on the shoulder, driver's door open, engine running. No driver, just muddy footprints leading out into the field that stopped after 20 yards. He said they never found the man, but when they checked the truck's dash cam, the footage ended with a flash of yellow light and a shadow leaning toward the windshield. I stopped driving nights not long after that. Sometimes I still have to pass through B County though, and every time I do, I make sure I reach Farm Road 666 before the sun goes down. I've learned that some things out there don't care if you believe in them or not. They just keep walking the same path, carrying the same light, waiting for someone to stop and offer a hand. And if you ever find yourself driving through B County at night and you see that faint yellow glow up ahead, do yourself a favor. Keep your eyes forward, hands on the wheel, and don't stop. Because when the lantern light goes out, you won't be the only one left standing in the dark. The renovation was supposed to be tidy. A new HVAC run, a few beams sistered to tame the sag over the west wing, refinished floors that would make the county judges feel like they were gliding into history instead of tripping over it. Gonzales County Courthouse had that kind of history you can feel in your teeth. Romanesque arches like a bunched fist, sandstone the color of dried peach, a clock that coughed out the quarter hour as if it were clearing dust from its throat. You could smell the Guadalupe from the square on certain days. A sweet green smell that rose up and turned the air bright and slick. That morning, the bakery threw cinnamon into the mix, and I remember thinking the town had never been kinder. I remember the way the old men on the bench watched us unload ductwork, the way their eyes went from the courthouse to our boots to the courthouse again, as if they were measuring us for whatever we were going to do to it. My name is Rex. I was in charge of the crew tearing out the rotted subfloor in the south corridor. The heat had been stuck high all week, and the plaster on the walls sweated like a feverish horse. When we pried up the first run of tongue and groove, we found a fault line of air where there should have been compacted fill. Not much, an inch or so where the dirt dipped. You learn to pay attention to the way a building breathes. I got down on my stomach with a flashlight and let the beam slide into the seam. The light returned with less of itself than I expected, swallowed by space under there, black and dry and oddly neat. "Void," said Eddie, my second. "Maybe an old crawl." "Someone would have cut vents," I said. They hadn't, no vents, no access hatch on the plans. We pulled more boards. The gap widened, and then the end of Eddie's crowbar struck something that rang like a kettle lid. The sound ticked through the corridor and down the stairwell to the basement, and then through the bones of the place. People looked up. The clerk stuck her head out of a records room with a paperclip between her teeth like a cigarette. We cleaned around the metal and found a square set in the joists, flush with the underside of the old floor. It had been hidden under 2 layers of oak, maybe since statehood. A trapdoor, iron-plated, with a ring sunk into a slot and a crust of varnish along the edges as if somebody had painted the floor to seal it shut forever. Paint chips flaked off like fish scales. The ring took both of us to lift. The hinges moaned once, then went quiet, like they didn't want anyone downstairs to hear. The breath that came up was not the smell of dead rats and damp that you expect under an old Texas building. It was warm. Not cool, not stale. Warm like the inside of a cupped hand. Warm like someone had just stepped out of a bath. It touched the sweat on my face and slid into it. Eddie swore and pulled back. I went down. It wasn't bravado. The warmth felt like a request. The drop was 10 feet to a packed dirt floor. 4 brick walls, darker than the sandstone of the courthouse, baked hard and jointed with a thin line of mortar, that had the look of something mixed on a morning when everyone was mad or hungover. There was a cot the size of a coffin lid, a ring set into the wall, a heavy chain with an iron cuff, a clay cup on a little shelf, and a door that wasn't a door at all but a false thing of planks mortared into the far wall. Somebody in the 1900s had gone to the trouble to fool future men into thinking there was a way out. I didn't see it at first because the beam of my light was shaking. When it steadied, the hair on my forearms did not. There were footprints on the floor, bare feet, small and narrow, dust pushed into crescents and lifted in the toe, a walk from the cot to the wall and back and then toward the center where I stood. The top layer of dust had been scored by that walk. The dust still held a fine pattern like the nap on a freshly brushed suit. It looked recent, like a minute ago recent. The warmth that moved around my shins made the backs of my knees throb. I put my hand on the cot. The canvas gave under my palm and the heat came through like a body had just risen from it. "It's still warm," I said up to the hole. If I had been less honest, I would not have said warm. I could have said not cold or less cold than expected or residual from the day's heat bleeding through. But it was warm and the footprints were fresh in the dust. Eddie was a hard man from Carnes City with sawdust in his hair and a twice-broken nose. If you put a gunshot on one end of a hallway and a whisper on the other, he'd walk toward the gunshot. He lowered himself by his arms and dropped lightly next to me. His breath caught when he saw the prints. He sat on his heels and touched one of the impressions with the pad of his index finger, as if he could find a pulse in dirt. He flinched, static, he lied. I could see the charge wasn't enough to make him move his hand. It was the idea of a pulse that scared him. We backed toward the center and the heat gathered as if we were standing in the door of a laundromat when a dryer door swings open. I pointed my light into the ceiling joists. No duct leaked. No steam line. No radiators anywhere in the courthouse had ever been connected to this space. We climbed out and I called the county project manager, a woman named York with hair that betrayed no weather. She wore suits the color of expensive smoke and had a way of being both in the room and not really there. Her eyes always a quarter block down the street. "Put a barrier around it," she said. "We'll get a historical consultant. Don't touch anything." We taped off the hole and put plywood over it and weighed the plywood down with bricks in case the building had ideas. The clerk who chewed paper clips came over and made a joke about Spanish treasure and little men in the walls. At lunch, I sat on the courthouse steps with my sandwich and watched kids on bicycles loop around the square. A cicada ground out a long metallic rasp in the live oak above me. The clock coughed and said 1. The bakery shook sugar out onto the air. I thought about warm air moving around my shins in a place where no sun had ever shone. I thought about bare feet that hadn't cooled. I told myself it was a sauna effect. The courthouse held heat and released it unevenly. But the rhythm of the release had made footprints in the dust and imprinted toes and instep, and that sliver of spearhead between the ball and the heel. The lie stayed small in my mouth. That afternoon, York brought a man named Tolliver who taught something at the university and wore a bow tie and a look like he loved it when the past misbehaved. We pulled the plywood and showed him the hole. He took photos. He asked us to photograph the prints with a ruler for scale. He asked if anyone had walked down there. I said yes. He asked if our tracks lay over the other tracks. I said no, we had stepped around them. He asked if we felt anything unusual. I said it was warm. He asked me to define warm. I said if my wife had been waiting in bed, that would have been the same feeling on my hand. He made a noise and wrote something down. The janitor came up from the basement with a mop and looked into the hole under his lashes as if he might catch sight of something that didn't want to be seen. He had worked there 28 years, which meant he knew more than anyone. He didn't speak unless he had to, but when he did, the words came out measured like he was counting them against some rule only he understood. They had a cell once, he said. Old sheriff used to put drunks in a little pen under the floor when the jail was full. I hear it was illegal and they got told. This could be that. My daddy worked here before me and told me there were places under places. He looked at the cot and the chain and the prints. I never heard about a door. At closing, the clerks filed out and the echo of their voices went down the stairs and up into the clock. The last of my men carried the shop vacs to the truck. The square turned blue, the kind of blue that makes you check your watch because it doesn't seem possible that day could be over yet. York told us the hole needed a night guard for liability. A person to make sure nobody got drunk in the square and fell in and sued the county. She looked at Eddie and Eddie looked at me. I said I'd take first shift. I told myself it was because I didn't want any of my boys in there with that heat and those prints and that cot that remembered a body. I sat with my back against a column. The shadows in the corridor got long and then they were the only thing. A second-hand radio on the floor played a station that couldn't decide if it was country or classic rock. It sounded like both had been put in a jar and left too long in the sun. The courthouse settled around me as night worked into its joints. In a place like that, settling is not the random tick and snap of wood. It's a conversation. Rooms asking each other if they are still there. I got up 3 times and checked the plywood. The bricks were where I left them. The tape held, but each time I felt the same thing under the iron plate that had been fixed to the joists for 100 years. A slow exhale, not of air but of certainty. My certainty left me 1 degree at a time. Around 2, the clock missed a chime. I waited for the correction that didn't come. The radio volunteers started a pledge drive and then went off the air. The live oaks outside rubbed their hands together and made a noise like low waves. I lay down on the floor beside the plywood and put my ear to it. Heat hummed against the boards. A tone more than a temperature. A sound like a hive heard from the other side of a barn wall. The tape around the hole lifted once as if a draft had questioned it and then settled. It was not fear that made me slide the bricks aside one by one. Fear would have kept me on my feet, would have sent me walking in wide circles around the square, smoking until the sun did what it does to old ideas. It was something else. A courtesy that rose out of the warm air. You can call a lot of things a request when you want to make your own choices sound less like yours. I lifted the plate and lowered myself into the cell alone. The hotel across the square left its red sign on all night. The light from it came through the trap and laid an old-fashioned glow on the brick. The kind of red you only see in the back of your eyelids when you've worked hard enough to earn sleep you aren't going to get. The footprints were where they had been, crisp as if dust were a thing capable of expressing intention. I stood in one. It fit my foot about as well as the prints on the beach in front of my house fit my daughter's foot years. Ego when she was small and would hop into my tracks for fun. Small, narrow. The air was warm and the warmth held itself against my throat. There is a thing that happens when the lights are often, a power station 5 miles away is sending electricity to the world. You feel the hum through your ribs even if the room is silent. That's what happened in that cell. The building's heartbeat drifted down and disguised itself as temperature. I walked along the prints. I stepped where the unknown had stepped, toe to toe to heel. I left my own mark in a place without wind. I came to the false door and put my hand on it. The boards were cold compared to the air, cold like paper that has been under glass for 100 years. Someone had carved letters in the second board from the bottom, a shallow scratch with a nail or a button pin. The letters had been sanded and painted and then scraped up from under. They were not a name. They were not initials. They read as if the person carving them had changed their mind halfway through and switched from a word into a mark that meant Keep what you know to yourself. I put my forehead against the board and felt the cold print of those letters on my skin. You can call it a dream if it keeps your life tidy. You can call it microsleep in a hot room, but what happened next came at me in the shape of fact and carried the weight of it. There was a step behind me where there was not enough space for another person to stand. The air changed in the way it does when someone steps into it. Heat redistributes. It had the stupid intimacy of a crowded elevator. I turned and there was nobody, but the footprints had new shine. Dust displaced dust. Fresh curls of it were thrown up at their edges like tiny breaking waves. I put my hand out and touched heat that had the contour of a shoulder. I said hello. I did not say it like I wanted an answer. I said it like a man makes a sound to keep himself a man. The shoulder moved under my hand in the way a human shoulder moves when it forgets someone is touching it. It shrugged boredom or sorrow. The chain on the wall lifted an inch and fell back. It was not loud, but everything in the courthouse heard it. The clock did a shudder and gave up on time entirely. The red hotel light flickered and set itself in some older mode that made the brick look wet. The warm air got warmer as if the heat had a way of leaning in. I had a flashlight in my pocket. I did not bring it out because I did not want the light to travel through a body and show me the wall. I kept my hands open and set my palms out at my hips like a referee. The movement made my fingers brush the iron cuff. It was warm in the way metal is warm after a person has worn it. Not hot, skin warm. For a second, my body told me how that warmth would feel closing around my own wrist. It wasn't pain my body imagined. It was relief. Like the instant when a belt finds a familiar notch. I set the cuff on the shelf next to the clay cup. The cup tipped and righted itself, most of its weight on the side away from me. Somebody breathed. I braced to meet air from outside my own lungs. It didn't come like that. It came in my mouth, my chest moving with effort that was not entirely mine. The breath smelled of cold brick and something honey sour under it that made me think of long storage. My eyes watered and the heat in the room found those tears and warmed them until each one sat in the corners of my eyes like old glass. Tell me your name, I said, because the living are always greedy for names. Names let us pretend we can call each other back. I felt the mouth of the heat come near my ear. There was no whisper. There was a pressure that lettered something into the side of my head without sound. It was the kind of name you do not say because your teeth are built for different syllables. It was a name like a length of chain dropped slowly onto stone so each link lays and then waits for the next. It did not feel male or female. It did not feel like a person whose shape I could remember later. It felt like the courthouse when it first learned to settle. The very first time the mortar decided to shift and tell the rest of the building how to do it. The warmth moved toward the cot. I went with it without deciding to. I sat on the edge and then I lay down, because lying down was the only way to match the way the heat arranged itself. It didn't climb on me. It made a space where a person could go and asked me to be the answer to the space. I let my shoulder drop into it. The dust smelled of paper too old to read. My heartbeat learned to copy the slow hum that lived under the floor. I woke to morning and Eddie's boots at the edge of the hole. He shouted my name and dropped into the cell without using the rope we'd knotted to the handle. He hauled me up by the back of my collar like a fisherman landing something that has to go back into the water. I stood on my feet on the good floor and felt the cold of morning hit my face. The warmth from the cell clung to me like I had walked out of a green screen where things had been applied to me that the world was never meant to see. York was there, with a deputy and a man from the county commission, who always looked as if his first taste of anything had been sour milk. They said words like trespass and liability and damn foolishness. I nodded and let their words slide away. What stuck were the looks Eddie and the janitor gave the bottom of my jeans. The cuffs were dusted with powder, and the powder had prints in it. Not just scuffs. Half moons and the spearhead between the ball and the heel. If I had been the sort of man who laughed, I would have. The footprints on my cuffs were too small to be mine. Tolliver returned at 10 and made a show of indignation at evidence disturbed. He had me stand next to the hole for scale. He took photos that made me look like the before picture, for a man who once believed buildings were just materials. He asked me to describe my night. I said I slept. He did not believe me and wrote it down anyway. By lunch, the courthouse had visitors. Gonzales loves its stories the way some towns love football. Half the square had their noses against the tape before Sheriff Halleck came in person and had the area cleared. He let a man from the paper take one photo before he made him put the camera away. He put on rubber gloves and went down into the cell himself, and was up again fast, white under his tan and acting like the heat was a trick someone had played on him. He said the floor was warm as a stove. He said there were prints. He said the chain felt like it had been held. York hired a night guard from an agency. The guard signed forms and sat in a folding chair outside the tape with a paperback in his pocket. He made it to 9 before he went looking for me with his eyes. I told him there's a thing with old buildings. If they want you to stay, you stay. If they don't, you go and tell yourself you left because of smoke alarms or codes. He laughed. He was still laughing when the clock missed another quarter hour. I did not volunteer to stay again. It was not fear. I had the thought that something had been put in my mouth the night before and I was now chewing on it without tasting it. If I stayed, I would learn the taste and I didn't want to know it yet. I went home to my house near the river and sat on my back steps while the neighbor's dog made a circle in the grass, like dogs do when they want to step into their own prints. The radio said the week would be hotter. My wife asked if the courthouse was going okay. I told her we had found something. She said it was always neat when the past showed up like that. I did not tell her that sometimes the past is a person who refuses to accept the time you claim as yours. The next morning, the guard was gone. He had signed out at 3, except he hadn't. His signature on the clipboard was not like the one on his forms. It was the same name drawn smaller, careful. Each letter as neat as those you carve with a nail in old wood when you don't want to be seen doing it. Sheriff Halleck put his hands on his hips and looked at York like the mess belonged to her. She looked at me like she knew who the mess belonged to. I went downstairs and found the guard asleep on the cot in the cell, with the chain laid across his thighs like a blanket. The warmth didn't feel like comfort that morning. It felt like a fever. When we woke him, his eyes were empty and slow to fill. He said sorry like a schoolboy. There are ways a story grows itself around you until you are inside it. The papers ran a short piece about an archaeological find and a human interest photo of the courthouse in morning light. People came around the tape after hours and tried to look brave. The janitor told me there had always been a rumor of a hidden cell for the worst cases, not criminals so much as people who made trouble by being unlucky. He told me once a wind had come down the stairwell and smelled like a storm in a year when no rain wanted to come. He told me the courthouse had a way of keeping its own set of books. We were ordered not to go down there again. The order made us almost honest. Eddie kept his eyes on his work and kept his body pulled toward the hole. I kept my hands busy and my mind on nothing, because nothing was the only thing that didn't throw me back down under that floor. It didn't work. I went down twice more, quick as a man might dip his feet into a river in summer. Each time the warm air set its hands around my calves like something with the right to be offended. Each time the footprints were fresh. They were never in the same pattern. One time there were 2 sets, and one was large and a little splay-footed, the walk of a man who worked fields or hauled lumber. There were marks on the wall that I hadn't seen before, faint arcs where metal had struck brick. Another time there were only the small prints, and they went from the cot to the chain and back and did not cross themselves, an argument that refused to resolve. On the 3rd day, Tolliver got permission to remove a brick from the false door for study. He drafted a letter and used words that made rooms important. York and Sheriff Halleck signed it with the reluctance of people who know something bad will happen if they agree and know something worse if they don't. Tolliver came with chisels and brushes as delicate as things you would use on a violin. He crouched and tapped and worked the mortar out grain by grain. He wore a surgeon's look. When the brick loosened, he lifted it like a newborn and set it on a foam pad. He leaned close to the gap and breathed in. He jerked back and pressed his hand to his chest. He didn't say hot. He didn't say warm. He said soft. The air on the other side of that false door was soft. He said it as if he had been waiting for softness his whole life and didn't know what to do with it, now that it had come. He slid his fingers into the gap and made a face I had seen on men who put their hands into water and find it blood without pain. He withdrew his fingers and stared at them. There was nothing on his skin. He trembled anyway. He fitted the brick back into place with the careful panic of someone who has let something out of a paper bag and hopes it has invisible rules. That night, the guard didn't come. York said the agency was short-staffed. Eddie said he'd stay. I told him he didn't want to. He went anyway because you can't stop a man from walking into his own print. I slept on my back porch and woke when the river birds screamed at something with no shape. In the morning, Eddie was in the parking lot leaning against his truck with his eyes closed. He had a smear of dust across his cheek in the shape of a hand. A small hand. He said he hadn't slept. He said he had not gone down there. He said the warmth had risen out of the hole like a breath and taken a tour of the hall and then stood behind him and listened to the radio play. A woman singing about a man who didn't exist anymore. He said he had felt a cuff around his wrist that wasn't there. When I touched his sleeve, the hair on my arms lifted and pressed hard against my skin like it wanted to be inside. On the 6th day, the footprints changed. They were mine. There is no way to soften that detail. I knew the angle of my big toe and the quarter moon scar left by a roofing nail that went through my instep when I was 20. The prints moved from the false door to the cot, and then to the base of the trap and then away toward the chain. Not exactly. They veered at the last second and stepped over themselves, a loop. A man telling himself, wait. Not yet. I took pictures because if I didn't, I would later tell myself I had imagined it. I printed one at the drugstore and put it in my glove box like a ticket to a show I didn't want to attend. I should have walked away. I should have told York to find another crew and another man who didn't taste heat in his sleep. The thing about a request is the longer you ignore it, the more politeness it accrues, the more it feels like a debt. On the 7th night, I went down alone without telling anyone. I brought a bottle of water and set it on the shelf next to the clay cup. It went warm in my hand while I held it and warmer when I set it down. The warmth collected behind me in a shape. There was weight in the shape this time, not much. The way a coat thrown over your shoulders is weight, a pleasant burden that says you are about to be allowed to rest. I lay on the cot and set my wrists on my chest because if I moved my hands to the side, the cuff would find them. I thought about the county judge's voice and the way it lifted when he admired the color of the new varnish on the restored stair rails. I thought about my daughter stepping into my footprints on a beach and then running ahead to make her own. The heat made a little sound where it met my ear, the tiny creak you hear when another person lies down next to you and the mattress accepts their load. The chain lifted and didn't fall. The false door let out a breath that did not smell like air. I was awake when the sheriff and York and Eddie found me because I had not slept at all. They had been called by the clerk who chewed paper clips because she had heard the chain, and it had spoken a word she didn't know and couldn't forget. I sat up when they appeared over the edge of the hole, faces like coin stacks in the red light of the hotel sign. I put my hands out to show them the cuffs were not on me. The warmth put its hand out of habit on my forearm, and then pulled back like it was being polite in front of company. York told me the project was paused. She told me we were done in the South Corridor, that the county would be convening a panel, that consultants would consult. She told me the hole would be sealed. The sheriff told her, you can't seal what a building is willing to tell you. He didn't sound convinced. We put the iron plate back and screwed it into steel straps we had bolted across the joists. We glued the edges and bricked up the stairwell door with the red light from the hotel, marking each brick redder. We laid down new oak and sanded and stained it until it matched the grain of the hallway. We returned the corridor to something that appeared to be itself. The warmth did not argue. It does not have to. It has the patience of a courthouse. I go by sometimes. I park under the live oaks and sit across from the bakery and pretend I came for coffee. The clock coughs out its hours. The air smells like the river when it is low. On certain days when the square is quiet and the judge's chambers are empty, and the janitor is upstairs running a floor machine in long, smooth arcs, you can watch the light on the oak change in a way that has nothing to do with clouds. It's the shape of a person stepping into shade. It's my shape. On those days I do not go in. The building is making its requests elsewhere. Perhaps to a young clerk who walks without making noise. Perhaps to an attorney waiting for a late client. Footprints appear in dust under floors no one plans to lift again. If you live in Gonzales long enough, you learn not to ask for certain details. You don't ask where the old cannon really came from. You don't ask what the warm wind is that sometimes kicks up in the square and smells like old paper and cinnamon. You don't ask why some nights the hotel sign goes red on and red off in a rhythm that doesn't match the clock. When I dream now, I'm in a room under a room and the hallway above is full of the kindest footsteps you ever heard. I wake up with my wrists crossed and the skin warm where nothing has touched me. I don't go to the courthouse anymore, not because I'm afraid the warmth will put a hand on me, but because I'm afraid of the day it won't. Last month, a crew came to install a drinking fountain in that corridor. They drilled and the bit walked half an inch to the left and bit into nothing. They found a hairline crack in the wood where there had not been one, a dark seam laid like a vein. They called me for advice. I told them to move the fountain 2 bays down. I told them to leave the seam alone. A week later in the bakery window there were prints on the inside glass, small half-moons and the spearhead between ball and heel. Someone wiped them with a rag and an hour later the prints were back. The baker put up a sign about children and touching. It didn't help. He started closing early. He leaves by the alley now. He says he hears something under the square, a soft sound like a person patiently shifting on a canvas bed. If you go into the courthouse on a hot day and stand very still in the south corridor, you will feel a layer of air that is warmer than the rest. It will brush your wrist first and then sit at your throat and ask you a question that does not have words. If you don't answer, you'll be fine for a while. If you answer, you may find your footprints in places you haven't walked yet. You may find warmth clinging to your clothes like a smell you can't wash out. You may decide, as I did, that some doors will always feel like home even if you never meant to live behind them. And if you stand there long enough, the red hotel sign will find a rhythm with your heart and the clock will learn your pauses, and the building will make a place for you in its books. That place will be a line with your name scratched into it and then sanded and painted over, and then scraped up from under in a room that is always warm and filled with fresh footprints in the dust. They still keep the dam lit at night. A string of sodium lamps throwing a flat orange across the concrete and the dark slab of water pressing against it. People say Canyon Lake looks peaceful after midnight. I say it looks like a held breath. You stand at the overlook and you hear cicadas, a truck on FM 306. And if the wind comes off the hill country just right, you hear the white hiss of water spilling out of the floodgates into the Guadalupe like a radio between stations. That was where I was when the first song came through. Sitting in my truck with the windows down, the air heavy with cedar and warm limestone. I was scanning the AM band the way I always do when I'm restless, letting the needle jog past preachers and farm reports and the kind of old love songs people pretend they don't know the words to. Then the speaker pushed a tone like a throat clearing, and a voice I knew better than my own said, "You're tuned to KCLG, The Lake." Keeping you company on the long dark KCLG went off the air in 1987, a detail I carry around like a bad tooth. I was 9 that summer and my father worked nights at the station, a blockhouse with a tin roof and a tower planted in a field of prickly pear near Startsville. He loved radio because it made him invisible and everywhere at the same time. He would sit in front of the board with his coffee and his box of cartridges, and I would watch the needles flick and the red on-air light glow. He taught me to cue a record, to find the groove with one finger, to feel the song coming before it started. When the station shut down, it was sudden and mean. The owner sold off the good equipment, the tower lease lapsed, and my father came home carrying a milk crate of tapes like a man who had been fired from the sky. He died the following spring, a heart that just quit. To me, it felt like the air itself had gone flat. I turned up the volume until the dashboard hummed. The voice on my speaker had a hill country drag that used to get my father free beers at the bowling alley. It sounded like him, and it sounded like every late-night DJ who ever sat alone and spoke into a red light, trying to send a feeling to strangers. The record crackle and the way he rested his breath on the consonants were right. Coming to you from the North Shore, where the moon floats like a quarter in a wishing well and the catfish don't sleep. We've got a request line open if you can find it and if you can hear us, and if you can't, well, maybe you're the lucky ones. Tonight's first dedication goes out to Madeline in Sattler. She wants to hear Blue Moon of Kentucky for her daddy who won't be coming home from shift. We see you. We hear you. This one's for you. The song rolled in thin and bright as if it had crossed a lot of darkness to reach me. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I laughed too loud, a sound like a metal spoon dropped on concrete. I told myself about temperature inversions and ducting, about how in the night layers of warm and cool air can bend a signal across counties, across states. I told myself KCLG had never been a big station, that even when it was alive it barely made it to New Braunfels without a fight. I told myself anything that wasn't the easier truth standing in the back of my skull with its hat in its hands. I let the record play, and when the DJ came back, the sound of his chair creaking through the microphone made an old room I hadn't been in for 30 years stand up in front of me. "You're listening to The Lake. We've got a caller on one. Go ahead, sweetheart, you're live." The voice that answered was thin and high, a little girl trying not to cry. "Mister, I can't find my mom." We were camping by the water and the light went out. He took it. He put the light in the water and it sank. "Can you tell her I'm in the cedar trees? Her name is Ruby." Static climbed in the pause that followed like long grass rubbing a fence. My hand shot to the knob, then fell away. The DJ sighed through his nose the way a father does when he can't fix what needs fixing. "Ruby, we've got you. Sit tight and count your breaths. We'll send someone. Folks out by Crane's Mill, keep an eye. If you see a girl in a striped shirt, bring her a blanket and a flashlight. This next one is for Ruby and for anyone else just holding on." The needle dropped and the opening bars of Stand By Me walked across the black water. I didn't call anyone. I don't know why. It was late and the sheriff's deputies I knew did not need a man with an old wound calling about a ghost radio. Besides, I had the childish conviction that if I spoke the wrong words, the fragile thing coming through my speakers would stop, and that would be worse. I stayed there and listened until the hour turned and the DJ began to read the Lake at Night community notices, the way he always used to. "Lost dog, answers to Dusty, last seen behind the dam. 2 tall boys in a red Thunderbird seen throwing beer bottles at the low water crossing. Knock it off. Down to limb on the curve by Fisher Store Road. If you're headed east, go easy." Then the dedications tightened like a noose. To the boys in the black Ford headed to the river, turn around. To Nina in the rental on Deer Hollow, lock your window. To the man on the porch in Spring Branch, put the rifle down and go inside. We can hear you breathing. People from that part of the county still swap stories about the lakes last night. Some say my father fell asleep at the board, and a record ran to the paper label and the needle burned a groove into it until the room filled with smoke. Some say a man came in with a box and set it on the desk and told my father to let it play, and that the room went so quiet he could hear the dust turning in the album sleeves. Some say it was just money and a bad signal and a station nobody cared about. A month after it went dark, the door was padlocked, the tower unbolted and carried away on a flatbed. And when I rode my bike out to the field, I found only the square of concrete where the transmitter had sat, and a patch of scorched earth like a handprint. A sound has weight. When you take it away, something sags. After that night at the dam, I started chasing the signal. It wasn't on any frequency that made sense. I would turn the dial slowly with my eyes on the road and the dashboard dim, and at random it would catch for a few seconds like a hook under skin. Some nights all I got was a half song and a goodbye. Some nights the board came alive and the DJ's voice took up my truck and filled it to the seams. He never said a name and he never said a date. He spoke as if the night were a steady country with good roads and no maps. I drove the river road. I parked outside the old station slab and watched deer step out and eat the tough grass along the ditch. I sat behind the VFW while men smoked and told jokes under a light that buzzed like a cheap transformer. I logged the times and the weather the way a fisherman writes down wind and moon phase, trying to find a pattern. I told no one because I wanted it to keep choosing me. The requests were for songs I half remembered from my father's milk crate. Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, Elvis with that echo like a man singing at the bottom of a well. They were also for things that felt wrong and too close. A woman asked for a hymn for her mother who was sick in the house by the pecan orchard, and the DJ said, "Hold her hand and we'll do our best." And a day later, the woman's obituary appeared on the board by the post office with a picture of a smiling face under a beehive of hair. A teen asked for metal and the DJ laughed and said, "We don't have that here, but we can give you thunder." And that same afternoon a storm blew down a line on 306, and a boy I didn't know went off the road near the gas station that used to have a payphone out front. There were nights when the lake took requests from people who were not alive, and I knew because they said the names of roads that had been moved, and the DJ said their names with a careful mercy that made me cry in the cab of my truck like I was 9 again, and the world was a room with a red light and everything depended on a hand not slipping. In August, the heat laid over the county like wet flannel, and the lake lowered itself inch by inch. You could see old fence posts and the tops of mesquite that had been drowned when they filled the basin in the 60s. Men threw cast nets in the shallows and came up with lures from other summers. I was working days hauling drywall for a contractor who said my back was good and my heart was soft. I slept in the afternoon on the couch with the TV on low. When I woke, the sun was a copper coin in the blinds and the house smelled like hot dust. The radio I keep in the kitchen hissed and then cleared like a sinus, and the lake was there as if it had been sitting in the next room waiting for me to open my eyes. We're coming up on sundown, friends. If you need to be somewhere other than where you are, now's the time. We've got a special request lined up. This one is from a fellow out near Canyon Park with a truck that won't start, and a pocket full of change and a throat full of something he can't swallow. He wants to hear Wichita lineman for his father, who taught him how to find a signal inside a storm. He wants to say he's sorry he left the crate on the porch. He wants to say he knows about the milk teeth his father kept in a coffee can. He wants to say he heard the last song. We've got you, buddy. This one's for you. I stared at the radio until the screen door blurred. I had a pocket full of screws and receipts. I had a truck that had been stalling in the heat. There was a coffee can of my baby teeth in my mother's closet that I had found when we moved her after she forgot the stove on twice. The song came with a sharpness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I went outside and my truck clicked once when I turned the key, and then was as dead as if someone had removed the engine. I stood in the heat and listened to the record run, and I didn't know whether to be angry or thankful or afraid. A neighbor kid rode by on his bike, his back silver with sweat, and he raised his hand to me without stopping. A salute from a world that made sense. I called the number I had written years before in a notebook. The payphone outside the gas station was gone, but the number was there beside a scribble of a tower and a line that said, "Dad's chair creaks." The phone rang twice and then a click, a real click, the heavy mechanical throat of an old switch, and the DJ came on as if I had called him across a hallway. "KCLG, the lake. What can we do for you?" I didn't think. I asked for a song I knew my father liked. A silly track with whistling and a chorus about being on the road. The DJ didn't answer right away. I pictured him leaning back, eyes closed, a finger on the record sleeve. "We can play that later," he said. "How about you tell me what you really want?" I sat down on the steps and watched the sky move. I told him I wanted to know where my father had gone when the light went out at the station. I wanted to know if he had been alone and if he had been afraid and if he had seen something he could not bear, and if he had chosen it or if it had chosen him. I wanted to know if he had ever listened to his own show when he was off shift. In the truck by the dam with the window down and the night laid out like a table, where you could set all your losses and see them look back at you. I wanted to know what the last broadcast had played that made the air go sweet and thin and then nothing. The DJ let a breath in, slow. He made a sound like the smile he had when he reached for a record he loved. "You want to hear your father," he said. "You want to hear him when he wasn't working. It's hard to hear somebody when they stop pushing the fader. We can help with that. Drive down to the slab where the tower used to be. Park on the dirt with your front tires on the edge of the old cable trench. Leave the keys on the seat. Walk until you can't hear the insects. When the water breathes, you'll know the way." I drove because instructions have always been my faith. The field was quieter than it had any right to be. The grass was yellow and unforgiving. By the slab there were beer cans and a singed ring where some boys had made a fire and pretended to be outlaws. I put the keys on the cracked vinyl as if I were offering a token to a toll taker. I walked in a crooked line toward the dark mass of oaks. The sound of insects fell away like someone had turned a knob. I have never been in a room as quiet as that patch of hill country under a sky going purple. The lake breathed once in the distance, a slap of water that traveled through the ground and up my legs. I stopped when I could smell wet rock. He was not there. Of course he was not there. There was a piece of fence half buried in the dirt, a chunk of concrete with rebar like a rib, a bottle cap. I stood still long enough for my sweat to cool. A whisper came up from the ground the way heat comes off a road in August, then grew until I understood I was standing in the ghost of a room full of machines. The whisper had a key to it, a pitch. It shaped itself into the rustle of paper, the cluck of a mechanical timer, the thud of a cart sliding into a slot, the small animal squeal of a microphone as someone's shirt brushed it. The hairs on my neck pulled tight. A chair creaked, a tone peeled, and my father cleared his throat. He sounded tired and kind. He spoke without the smile he gave callers and without the jokes he threw, and his voice filled the place where the air had weight. He said he wasn't alone. He said the room was crowded and the lights were off. He said the controls were moving under his hands the way a boat's tiller moves when the river is doing the steering. He said there was a list on the wall he didn't remember writing, and he was reading names he had never learned. And each time he read one, the room got cooler and the world got smaller and the lake grew a third shore. He said he hoped I would never hear this, and he said he knew I would, and he said that was all right. He said he could see the dam lights from where he sat even with his eyes closed. He said he could hear me. He said my name like a man putting a hand on a door he cannot open and cannot walk away from. When the signal left the ground, it took something cheap with it. The air turned hard and strange. Down by the water, a pontoon boat idled and a voice called a hello, and then the engine coughed as if swallowing something and went still. To my right, a shape the size of a deer moved without sound between two trees and paused. It took me a full long minute to see that I was looking at the square of the old transmitter building, not in stone but in pressure. an absence that made a box. The on-air light floated at about the right height, not seen but felt, a point of red in the skull. The board was there, its face cool as a creek rock. I reached out and found a fader, and when I pushed it up, the lake climbed into me with its whole ancient chest. "KCLG, the lake," the voice said. "We've got time for one more. This one's for the man up on the slab who thinks the night makes him invisible. He's been listening a long time. He's been learning the grooves. He wants to hear Sleepwalk for his boy, and for the way the road looks when you leave a place you meant to stay. He wants to know if the requests ever end. Buddy, they do not, but some of them change you before they get played. I don't remember walking back to the truck. I don't remember sleeping. For days afterward, the radio would wake on its own. I would hear the DJ read a name before it appeared anywhere a living person could have put it. I would hear the lake take calls from men with old crimes in their throats and from women whose missing would never be reported by anyone with power. Sometimes I would hear my father laugh at something I had said when I was 9 and had come into the room with a king snake in a coffee can and dumped it on the floor. Sometimes I would hear him say my name with a new weight, like he had been lifting it alone for years. Last night the signal came so clean it made my kitchen look like a set. The DJ played a jingle I hadn't heard since I sat cross-legged on the carpet with a comic book and a bowl of cold cereal. A little melody about the lake being where you belong that a woman in San Antonio had sung for $100 and a handshake. Then he took a breath and said, "We've got a special one. This is a request from a man named Aaron who lives out by the dam. He's been a good listener. He's kept us company. He wants to hear the end of the world for a boy who never got to say goodbye to his father. He wants to say he's going to drive down to the overlook after midnight and park his truck with the windows down and wait until the wind shifts. He wants to say he'll bring the crate he kept all these years and set it on the concrete. He wants to say he's ready to hear the last broadcast." I turned off the radio by ripping the cord out of the wall. The refrigerator clicked and hummed back into itself. The house was full of the small sounds of a place that is trying to be kind. I stood there holding the cord like a tail. I went into the hall closet and took down the crate that still smelled like my father's cigarettes and old glue. The tapes were labeled in his careful block letters, date and hour and a word for the mood of the night. Soft rain, hot wind, fox in the ditch. I carried the crate to the truck and put it on the passenger seat. The keys were heavier than I remembered. I drove to the overlook, because of course I did. Because all of us live over something that is trying to talk us into coming home. The dam lights were the same. The water said nothing. The radio was dead. I waited. I thought about the way a request works. How a person calls a lonely room and asks to be seen by listening. How a man in the middle of the night can say another person's name into a microphone and change the shape of the county without anyone knowing. I put my hand on the crate. I felt the tapes shifting slightly inside as if someone had moved in the other room. I thought about how the lake took requests from people who weren't alive and wondered when a person knows which side of the request line they are standing. The first note came up through the chassis of the truck rather than through the speaker. It vibrated the steering wheel and my ribs. The DJ said good evening, friends, and said my name and asked me if I was ready. He told me to open the door and leave the keys on the seat. He told me to bring the crate and walk where the insects stop and the water breathes. He told me there was time for one more. He told me the songs were always there, pressed into the dark, waiting for somebody with careful hands to find the groove and let the needle fall.
He told me I could say no.
I sat a long time. The wind shifted once, a tired animal turning in its sleep. The dam lights hurt my eyes. I could hear someone laughing in the distance in a way that made my stomach clench and then release. I put my hand on the key. It felt like the edge of a record, smooth and dangerous. I took a breath the way the DJ might take a breath when he knows the red light is about to come on. I picked up the crate. I stepped into the warm dark where the signal lives and where requests keep coming, long after the people who made them have walked out into the hill country and let the song take their names.